All right, guys, welcome to episode 73 of the Lookout Sir Warhammer 40,000 podcast. My name is Dan, and it is indeed my honour, privilege, and or profession. I don't do this for money, although maybe one day. Ooh. Although, to be honest with you, it's not really my aspiration either. I just love the sound of my own voice. But someone who isn't so keen is my good buddy, Phil. How's it going, Phil?
I'm all right, although I think I've got a weird-sounding voice, so I'm not too keen on mine.
You don't love the sound of your own voice?
I don't, no.
Is it weird when, I suppose... have you gotten to the point? So for me, now, I am completely comfortable and, you know, accommodating towards the sound of my own voice, in so much as it's familiar to me now, is what I'm saying. I know what I sound like. Whereas a lot of people out there, when they hear themselves on tape, as they would say once, find it quite shocking. Are you still at that stage, Phil?
Probably. I think I've just resigned myself to the fact that I've got a really weird voice, and people just have to listen to it.
What particular aspect of your voice is it that you think is weird?
I don't want to get into it.
No? We're dredging up a few too many very real and very personal things.
The PTSD's coming.
Well, crikey. Well, we best not make light of that in this moment, Phil. Leave it to be said that we'll let you, handle that in your own way. And on the topic of past trauma, we're going to be talking about what, Phil?
My favourite thing that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, but it's finally here. It's in my hands. It's Maelstrom of War. Ooh.
The Maelstrom of War. Famously, the Lookout Sir 40k podcast has been a bit of a champion of the Maelstrom of the War of War in the past. And today we will be discussing that and finding out whether we still are. So hopefully you enjoy that. But before we get into that, we of course have to do our 5-star review.
Hang on a second, what is this? Some kind of review? A 5-star review? Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this Warhammer 5-star review.
This week's 5-star review comes from Apple Podcasts of Great Britain, and the individual who gave us this 5-star review goes by the name of Aubreii, which is probably me butchering a really obvious name. You'll probably read it and go, no, Dan, that's how you say Kevin. But it is spelled Aubreii. What does that sound like to you, Phil?
Aubreii? I don't know.
Aubreii?
Yeah,
that's where I was sort of going with it. But then I thought, is it Aubreii? I don't know. You never want to presume with these things.
Well, the English language is a wonderful thing where any word can be pronounced pretty much any way you might want it to be. And there's not necessarily one right answer.
Exactly. Maybe in the future we need, people submitting these wonderful 5-star reviews to give us some kind of phonetic spelling to associate with their work, so as we can be certain that we are, delivering the information in the best way possible. That would be appreciated, for sure. Absolutely. It would definitely be a good thing. But this individual, who will from this point forwards be referred to as this individual, said a major step up, 5 stars. I've held off writing a review as a while. I've held off writing a review as while I enjoy. Oh, right. Okay. Right. See, what did I say in the last one?
On the podcast, You're learning to read.
This is a big part of the podcast process, right? This is me, just spell out say out the letters, put them together. Anyway, I've held off writing a review as while I enjoy the show, I never really got through a whole one. There we are. They were quite long before, weren't they, Phil?
I know, but you missed out on the end, like where we do the rambles and all sorts.
Well, exactly. Also, as well, it's fair to say that the shows at the moment are still quite long at times, though, aren't they?
It's pretty mad. That Dark Angels episode, it nearly broke me.
I love how you sound so trapped. It's like, I know, I want so badly to go home, even though that's exactly where you are and I am. Not in the same one, obviously, but different places. Anyway, the change in format has been a game changer. The topics feel more relevant and timely. The chat is, dare I say, more focused, although potentially we've fallen into some old habits already here. The rambles are in the Goldilocks range of not too long, not too little, just right. So there you go.
That's good.
So now, very happy to leave 5-star for the show and its new format. Can I just add that it's been really great to hear Phil a bit more. Thank you for the knowledge, the insight, and the brilliant banter, FatFlash. Okay, so they're also called FatFlash, this individual.
Well, we can't get that one wrong.
Exactly. FatFlash is very easy for me to process. So from here on out, FatFlash is how we refer to this individual. Phil, they were very kind to you, so why don't you be kind in return to FatFlash?
FatFlash, thank you very much for your kind words. Considerate, measured, accurate. You are right, we are in that Goldilocks range. A bit rambly, not too rambly. Get to hear me a bit more. So, even though I don't like the sound of my voice, you clearly do. So thank you very much.
I don't think he necessarily stated that he enjoys the sound of your voice. I think it was more that they
It was
were
inferred.
stating that it was inferred.
Yeah.
Is that what you inferred from the whole
Yeah.
thing, that they like the sound of your voice?
For sure.
Well, that's good. I mean, at least someone does, Phil.
For sure.
You may not, but,
Exactly.
But FatFlash is all about that. And if you want to be a great, human being, individual, person of great significance like FatFlash, you need only go to a place where you can leave a 5-star review, place it there, and then tell us about it. Unless, of course, it's on Apple Podcasts, because that gets pulled through quite handy. But if you have left us a 5-star review in a location we may not be aware of, please reach out to us and tell us, because we want to shout you out and show our appreciation. We just may not know it exists yet. But yeah, no, genuinely, please leave us a 5-star review. One, because as of today's recording, Pancake Day, we only have 2 more 5-star reviews until we run out. So this is the perfect time. I know, the perfect time to swoop in and, more or less guarantee yourself a slot in the coveted 5-star review segment.
That's brilliant. And if people
weird,
want to reach out to us, I guess they can do it via our Instagram, our Facebook. Have we got anything else? Oh, our YouTube comments, of course, as well.
Of course, there we go. That was fabulous work there, Phil. It's like we're doing a QVC program all of a sudden.
I know. Yeah.
And if they call now, Phil, what can they get extra?
I'm lost.
He's broken.
No,
he's got nothing.
I can't do it.
He's worried that he might actually say something that he might have to uphold. He's
Exactly.
concerned
I
by
don't want to
the
be contractually held to anything at this
Yeah.
stage.
You said on your show, if I called you, I'd get a thing. Well, you'll get nothing except potentially called out over
Gratitude.
the internet. That's all we have to offer. Little else is available here. So let's get on with the show. Transitional noise. Woo! Hello once again, everybody. We're going to talk about Maelstrom of War, which, if you are not familiar with already, Phil, tell them where they can find these beta rules, which we're going to be talking through today.
It is in the latest White Dwarf issue, number 461, which I guess is the March issue. Yeah, because they always do it effectively a sort of month ahead, so it'll be the March issue. So the White Dwarf rules, that's where they are for Maelstrom. It's all in beta. So they're sort of test rules, which from the outset, it's very cool that they've got them in print. But if they do want feedback from people playing them, I sort of feel like they should just release them for free on the Warhammer community website as well.
Which you would assume is coming down the line, right?
Maybe, hopefully.
I think that's an essential aspect of this process, though, right? I mean, ultimately, at some point, if they want to get feedback from the community on this, I assume they need to make it more widely available. But then maybe they just assert that, they've obviously got a large subscriber base and hopefully, or a large, readership of White Dwarf, and they're hopeful that, enough people will take an interest and give it a go. And certainly we have. I think it's fair to state from the outset, and we kind of teased this in the intro, myself, Phil, and previously, other contributors have stated in the past that we have a relative fondness for the Maelstrom system. The Maelstrom system effectively started coming into existence within games of 40k around, I believe, 6th edition was when they started introducing the concept. In fact, actually, I almost feel like they started introducing like open war or battle cards or a card-based system maybe around late 5th edition. But definitely firmly remember them introducing the idea into 6th edition and then developing it further into 7th and then subsequently 8th edition. And traditionally, Maelstrom has essentially been...
Well, not 8th edition, because it disappeared in 8th edition.
No, it's disappeared in 9th edition, Phil.
No, it didn't exist in 8th edition either.
Phil, have you lost your mind?
Have I?
I think you have, Phil. Right, 8th edition, as in...
Oh yeah, maybe no, yeah, you're right. Okay, I'm just getting mad. It's been that
totally
long.
off the
It's been that long. It's been that long.
What,
It feels
6
like
months?
we've not had it for ages.
Wow, yeah. Phil, man. God bless you. Yeah, no, 8th edition, it was very prominently featured. There was they really tried to push it in 8th edition in many ways. I think, if anything, 8th edition was where they gave it their best go.
Yeah, because that was the one that had it was in the chapter approved, wasn't it?
Well, no, so they enhanced it in chapter approved, but it was always in the main rule book. It was in every codex. Everyone who bought stratagem cards came with Maelstrom cards and psychic powers and
yes, that was it.
other things in conjunction with that. So it's a huge, huge part of 8th edition.
And in fact, the last version of it was in another White Dwarf magazine. That was where they did the deck building aspect.
Yes. So they rolled it out first in White Dwarf and then later put it in chapter approved, right?
Oh, yeah. God, my memory's so bad.
Mate, what has happened to you? Are you all right? Do you need to go away and eat some more fish or something?
Maybe.
You need some more...
Get that cod liver oil in me.
Yeah, exactly, man. You got to get some more cod liver oil in you for sure. Sorry, man. I don't mean to make such a sort of spectacle of you about that, but it's like, no, seriously, mate, genuinely. 8th edition had lots of Maelstrom. But look, anyway, the point is that there were a number of baked-in issues with Maelstrom, especially as the quote-unquote competitive scene really has taken off. And I think it's fair to say that one of the major issues that Maelstrom had was that it was really difficult to game it in any kind of meaningful way, at least out of its kind of vanilla form. And essentially, there were also a number of exploits that people were potentially taking advantage of, whether mistakenly or on purpose, whatever people's intent, I suppose, is theirs and theirs alone to interpret. But ultimately, Maelstrom had a lot of problems baked into it by the nature of its gameplay mechanisms and how it actually worked. A lot of that was addressed in Chapter Approved 2019 for 8th edition Warhammer 40,000. Chapter Approved 2019 introduced a really, really robust and actually quite usable system that utilized the card mechanics really well in conjunction with another series of, gameplay design decisions that just made the Maelstrom missions in 8th edition Chapter Approved 2019, in my opinion, one of the best ways to play 40k in recent years. I was relatively mocked at the time when I went up to Warhammer World shortly after putting out that episode. There were a lot of people who I'd met up with or was chatting to and going, "God, you really like that new Maelstrom edition? Is it any good?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I love it." It's but Maelstrom's rubbish. And it's like, no.
Well, yeah, I think the perception of Maelstrom was it was just too random. Therefore, it's not a legitimate way of proving to your opponent that you're better than them, because and quite often that was the case, especially in the earlier versions. It's all sort of luck of the draw with the cards, whether you can even achieve the objective on the card, because originally, if you drew a card that you couldn't do, you were stuck with it and you could discard it at the end of your turn. And then most people just house ruled it, where if you drew a card that you couldn't actually achieve, you could just redraw another one. So that sort of solved it. In the last version, what they did is a deck building mechanic where you could tailor your deck to your opponent. So if they don't have any flyers, you take the one card out that says you've got to kill a flyer, for example, or psychers or whatever it might be. The other one I think most people complain about was the scoring aspect. So you had most cards were like worth 1 victory point, but you had some that were D3 victory points, which was very swingy and down to the luck of a dice roll. So I could have 2 cards that scored me like 2 D3, and you could have 2 cards that scored 2 D3. I could score 2, you could score 6, and then you're really far ahead because you're effectively 4 victory points ahead, which is predominantly 1 victory point per card. So I need to do another 4 objectives just to catch up, unless I could get another card that has the D3 on it and somehow roll really well. So I think those two aspects were the thing that was a problem, and a lot of people house ruled it where the D3 victory points was just worth 2, which was actually kind of a nice way of getting around that.
Did that become, again, obviously we're dealing in the olden times now when we start talking about that, but for some reason I feel like that potentially was even stipulated in the CA 2019 rules, that they changed that to fixed points, or maybe I'm making that up. Anyway, irrespective, let's not try and remember the hypotheticals on that front. I think, there were a number of issues with the way that Maelstrom played. They resolved a lot of those with the changes to the system in the 2019 chapter approved. But beyond that, it was already sort of too far gone, I think, at that point. And I think no one was really willing to, give it a second chance. And understandably, Games Workshop obviously responded to this by seemingly removing it from 9th edition, despite the fact that it was referenced within the rulebook. And now, obviously, we're starting to see rules manifest themselves in White Dwarfs, and hopefully will be available as different ways to play in the future in a more kind of, quote, official capacity. So where best to start with Maelstrom? I think probably the most important thing to say about this beta rule set for Maelstrom is that it is totally different mechanically to what it was before, but is fundamentally performing the same function, if that makes sense. So the big change from the outset is we don't have cards anymore. Now, I would argue straight away that having cards would be beneficial, but there isn't a product that GW sells yet that fulfills that function. So where cards have gone away, tables have crept in, as had a certain amount of additional customization options and ways that you as a player can seek to control the outcome. But before we get into that, I imagine Phil wants to kind of talk through page 82 of White Dwarf issue 400, whatever he said, and break down what is in this and what we need to be covering off.
Yeah, so obviously they're beta rules. They do explicitly say that they've got 3 outcomes for what they want from this. One of them is that the community is really happy with it, and in which case they put it in a brand new mission pack, which is ultimately what we assumed would happen to Maelstrom at some point down the line. The other one is that they just probably need some tweaks. And then the last one is that basically no one likes it, and they're going to completely go back to the drawing board on it. On a note about the card mechanic, I think that's just inherently how they've got to do it, by moving it to tables, because obviously you can't have a bunch of pages that you can print out and turn into a deck. I could almost see this just being transported in a final version where they move it over to cards and then slightly tweak some of the mechanics. But for tables, it kind of works. And it
would have been nice to see them give us, like, even if it was just a pack of cards. So there's 36 different Maelstrom outcomes. It would have been nice if maybe they'd just given us 36 cards numbered 1 to 6 with different artwork or whatever corresponding to the different tables. Like, even that would have been a nice little gimme in the White Dwarf, just to be like a gaming aid, because I feel like a lot of people who are going to play this game or test this game are going to probably land at, we need to produce some kind of additional game aid in order to make this move smoothly.
Yeah, I mean, they even say, like, you can still use the old Maelstrom of War missions from 8th edition. They say it's perfectly possible, but they wanted to deliberately try and do something different rather than just redo the last version. And I could almost envisage like 2 versions of it, like a card version of Maelstrom and this sort of table-based one, and they're sort of very different ways of playing, but ultimately still under the Maelstrom banner. Anyway, so in terms of what Maelstrom comprises of, we've got our tactical objectives, we've got our Maelstrom of War games, we've got the deployment maps, of which there are 3. We've got stratagems, which are specific to playing Maelstrom of War, and we've got the actual missions as well. So the first thing is we've got our tactical objectives. Tactical objectives, as Dan said, they've replaced the cards with a bunch of tables. Each table has a particular category. So if you think about the secondary objectives in a normal Eternal War or GT pack, is very much like that. And then rather than just picking one, you're actually predominantly rolling on that table every battle round. We can go through individual missions because they tweak it slightly, but the way they fundamentally work is you pick 3 categories that you're going to be rolling on, and then at the start of every battle round, you randomly generate a tactical objective. Sometimes you are randomly generating the category that you're rolling. So you've got your 3 categories. You might be rolling a D3 to select that category and then a D6 to generate the exact tactical objective. And you predominantly rolling up to 3 times. So each person has 3 objectives every battle round that they're achieving. At the end of the battle round, the objectives disappear. You can use a stratagem to make one stick around for another turn if you want.
Do you think, Phil, even though the order of ceremonies as laid out in the book is that they go through the 6 different tactical objective tables, that it might be better if we started with a Maelstrom of War game structure?
Yes.
So talking about select the battle size, muster your army, determine mission, so on and so forth. Because I feel like that gives a bit more context to these missions and how this is structured, I suppose.
Yeah, so it gives you the full breakdown of how to play a game, like a mini mission pack. So the first thing you need to do is select your battle size. You got Incursion, Strike Force, and Onslaught, and they give you a recommended duration time. So Incursions, your small 1,000-point games up to 2 hours. Onslaught up to 4 hours. Once you've done that, you muster your armies. So again, you've got Incursion, Strike Force, Onslaught. Obviously, Strike Force is the one most people would play, which is 2,000 points at 12 command points. So that's pretty much the same as usual. They've got
almost identical, as it were, and they all have the same command point benefits and other bits and pieces, right?
Yep, and the same limitations about you've got to have a sort of fixed faction keyword across all your detachments, for example. You can't have under strength units. It's pretty standard. Step 3 is determine a mission. So you basically can either agree on, or if not, you can roll a d6 to randomly generate one of the 6 missions. You've got territorial control, ambitious surge, complex front, subterfuge and interference, chaotic engagement, and never surrender. Once you've done that, you can determine your deployment map, and you just either agree on it, like with the missions, or you can roll a d3. You've basically got 3 choices. You've got Dawn of War, which is quite interesting because it's got a specific deployment map for Incursion and a regular size for Strike Force and Onslaught. So Strike Force and Onslaught is the same size as normal. Everyone deploys 12 inches away from the center. Incursion, they specifically say it's 9 inches from center, so you're immediately a lot closer to your opponent. Hammer and Anvil, same as before, deploying opposite, but on the long table edge. And then the Search and Destroy is the table quarters with the 9-inch bubble in the middle that you can't deploy in. And then
so these are all the same names as what these deployment types had in their 8th edition form, right?
Yes. So anyone that's played 40k would probably understand those 3 names. Yeah. The only additional thing they've done is they've stipulated the battlefield edge as per how they've done it in 9th edition, but also there's a player territory, which is basically 50% of the board from the center is your territory and the other side is your opponent's territory, and that's just to deal with where you place your objectives.
Yeah.
So once you've done your deployment map, you then read the mission briefing. So we can read one out just to give people a bit of a taster as to what the missions might be. So territorial control is the one we played yesterday on Tabletop Simulator.
That is the one, number 1 on the old
exactly.
missions.
There's a bit of flavor text which I'll pass over. Copyright Games Workshop.
Are you just trying to not embarrass yourself like I do when I have to read things out?
I'm sure I could give it a go, but obviously I hate.
It's all right. Let's keep it lean.
Yeah. You basically then select your tactical objectives. So you select your 3 categories of objectives, and you mark them out as alpha, beta, and gamma. Sometimes I think you do that with all. Actually, no. I think half of them you have to do that. The other half you just select them, and you don't have to divvy them out. It then talks about generating your tactical objectives, which is slightly different depending on each mission. So in this one, it says, at the start of a battle round, starting with the player who had the first turn, players alternate generating 1 tactical objective each until each has generated 3 tactical objectives. Each time a player generates a tactical objective, roll d3 to see which of the player's selected categories is generated from, as shown in the table below. So you have a d3 table. 1 equals the objective category alpha, 2 equals beta, 3 equals gamma. So you just need to go 1, 2, 3. These are my 3 categories. Which of these categories am I randomly selecting? And then I'm rolling a d6 to generate my objective. Mm-hmm. And then also every mission has a specific mission rule, which instantly makes every single game completely different. This one has territorial control. From the second battle round onwards, at the start of each battle round, if one player controls more objective markers than their opponent, that player generates a 4th tactical objective for that battle round. So there's an innate advantage to controlling more objectives than your opponent, because you're suddenly generating an extra tactical objective that you can achieve that's worth a bunch of points. I'll make a little point now that the tactical objectives are all worth 5 victory points each, except for the very first one, which is worth 8 victory points, which tends to be slightly harder to achieve.
And to clarify, that's the first one of each category. So there's 6 categories, numbered 1 to 6 in terms of the tactical objectives within said category. If you roll a 1 or use a stratagem or by some other means land on a 1, you essentially get access to the tactical objective that is worth 8 victory points.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So once you've done that and selected your objective categories, you then create the battlefield as usual. So standard Strike Force game, 44 by 60 minimum, could be larger. You are allowed to use them. Then you determine the attacker and defender. So you roll off with the winner deciding whether he's going to be the attacker or defender. You then place the objective markers. And this is quite specific. Starting with the defender, players alternate placing objective markers 1 at a time and until each one has done so. If you're doing an incursion game, you only have 2 objectives per player. If you're doing Strike Force and Onslaught, it's 3. Each time you place an objective, it's the usual thing. It's got to be within a player's territory. It doesn't have to be yours, so you can place it in your opponent's. It can't be within the player's deployment zone. So when I said about the maps being split, 50-50 is in a player area. So basically you're placing objectives in that kind of middle strip outside of your deployment zone. They can't be 3 inches from any battlefield edge. They can't be within 12 inches of another objective marker, which is pretty standard. But no more than half objective markers can be set up within either player's territory. So you have to have an equal amount in each side of the board, excluding deployment zones. Then the defender selects one of the deployment zones for their army and uses that as the deployment zone. Then you have to...
What's interesting about that is that theoretically already you have placed objectives based on an area, but then you choose your deployment zone.
Yeah, because I think in the past, didn't you? Or actually, no, yeah, that was the same as before. You never knew which side you were picking. So there's always
when you were placing the objective markers. But the specific stipulation here is that starting with the defending players alternate placing objective markers on battlefield 1 at a time. To each player has done so. Each player places an objective marker. That objective marker must be wholly within a player's territory. So the implication there would be that I need to put my stuff in my territory. But I, as of this moment in time, based on this order of events, don't know which is my territory.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you as the defending player in this instance who has the choice, I guess, is just working on the assertion that where you're placing these objective markers will go on to become your territory. But I suppose there creates another interesting kind of gaming element to an extent, because I guess you can place stuff and then give it to your opponent, but that doesn't really come across in the way they've written this rule. So if we were to take the time to send an email to GW, or hopefully maybe they listen to this feedback on their rule set, that feels like something that needs some clarification, right?
Well, I think it's clear, but when we played yesterday, it wasn't clear, because they just say that you must be wholly within a player's territory. They don't say your player territory, so you can place it in your opponent's territory.
Oh, okay.
Because it's a player's territory.
Fine. So the interpretation that you're leaning towards is that effectively it just needs to reside somewhere outside of a deployment zone that is classified as a player's territory, not necessarily your territory. Because
you have to do because I think in the olden game you could load up your opponent's territory with more objectives than is in yours, and if you were a defender, you go, "Oh, cool, we're switching sides. I'm having that side now." Because you didn't realise that I had that choice. Whereas here, it's like it has to be 50-50. So even if I placed an objective in your side, as in where you'd be standing, you would then have to place one in mine. But then me as the defender would still get to pick which side ultimately I end up on.
And I think also another last thing that's interesting about placing objectives with this mission type is there's no stipulation around objectives not being placed on terrain features, correct?
Do you know what? You're right, because...
Yeah, so you create the battlefield first, then you place objectives.
Yeah, which is something new, because that was never the case, or it used to be historically, then it got changed to you do objectives, then create the battlefield.
Correct, yeah.
So unless there's something specific in the core rules of the game about that, which I wouldn't have thought there would be...
everything is
yeah.
Games Workshop have gone to a point with their rules systems where they've essentially departmentalized everything.
Yes, into the mission packs now.
Yeah, it's all you're playing a specific version of a game with this specific rule. So everything is supplemented essentially.
In a way, that's
the core
good.
rules.
Because
the bolter.
Yeah, I think that's good, because we were saying about the whole height issue and the verticality of the terrain, that in a way it's a shame sometimes that you can't put an objective on the second floor. It's like I kind of get why, but now, especially for Maelstrom, it's like that could be an interesting.
Yeah, I love it. I'm absolutely in favour of it. I think objective markers should be allowed to be at the top of a skyscraper.
Well, because now you can, it allows you to kind of thematically go, this ruin here on the second floor has like a control console, and this is the data point that we're going to hold, as opposed to some arbitrary point in the middle of no man's land that sort of feels a bit wrong.
Absolutely, man. No, I'm much more in favour of people placing their objectives on top of stuff if it makes sense to do so. Yep. I mean, maybe not in competitive play 100% of the time, but, in normal games, much more in favour.
Yeah, and so once you've done your deployment zones, you then have to number your objectives. So numbering them 1, 2, and 3 if you're doing a larger game, or 1 and 2 for an incursion game. And your opponent does the exact same thing. So you don't have 1 to 6 like you would historically. You have 1 to 3 and then 1 to 3.
And do you... Sorry, again, so you're numbering the objectives that are now in your territory. So you have now chosen your territory. Now you number your objectives.
Yeah, it says each player then numbers the objective markers in their territory, starting at 1.
Gotcha. So essentially, we've placed objectives, you've chosen your territory, and then you flip a token, an objective marker, to now be objective marker number 1.
So the way I would do it is most people have objective markers that are numbered 1 to 6. So one player has 1 to 3, and the other person has 4 to 6, but counts 4 as 1, 6
or
as
it just
3.
means that, or it just means that people turn up with their own objective markers, which is probably a nicer way of doing stuff.
That's also true. I mean, sometimes it's nice to have a kind of consistency of design and size, for example, because people have different size objective markers. But in a way, it's an excuse for Games Workshop to sell brand new sets of objective markers that are numbered 1 to 3 rather than 1 to 6.
Or for players to create their own custom objective markers.
Creating their own is by far the best way of doing it. So that's what they should do. And that has an impact on the sort of specific tactical objectives when you've got to achieve them. They call out those numbers. And they're always relating to in, for example, your deployment zone or your opponent, sorry, in your player zone or your opponent's player zone. Whereas obviously in the past, it's like, objective number 6, which could be randomly somewhere on the board. It's sort of much more clear cut here that you're sort of attacking or defending a lot of the time with those tactical objectives. Then it says each player then secretly selects their tactical objective categories for the game as specified in the mission briefing. So we didn't do that in the first step, but the mission briefing relates to this. So it's at this point you select your tactical objectives based on your opponents, what they've got, because each category, a bit like the kind of current secondaries, is tailored in some way, which I guess might be a good place just to sort of briefly talk over about the categories. I
think this is probably the bestest time to, bring it back to the categories. So you've got 6 different tables, each with different themes, I suppose. Table number 1 is Brought Low, which is a tactical objective themed around the death of every mighty hero and destruction of every battle tank weakens the foe greatly. So essentially, it's about killing big and or important things.
Yeah, vehicles and monsters specifically.
Yes. Although there is some stuff in there around objective markers. They do kind of give you a gimme should it be that you find yourself needing to roll on this table after having successfully killed every monster or vehicle that was there, and you roll your D3 and you land here and you can't achieve anything. There is always something you can do in each table.
Yeah, so they've got a special rule that says if you can't do, and it's worded very specifically, so I'll read it out. It's like, if an tactical objective mentions a unit with a specific keyword from either your army or your opponents, and there are no units with that keyword in that army on the battlefield, then that tactical objective is considered unachievable. At any time in which a player generates an unachievable tactical objective, they can instead select a different tactical objective from the same category to replace it. Likewise, if you roll on one tactical objective that you've already got, so you've got a duplicate, you also get to pick again as opposed to rolling again. So getting a duplicate or one that you can't do, weirdly, is a kind of a good benefit because you get to pick whichever one on that category that you want to do.
Yeah, which is pretty huge for the way it kind of shakes out. But again, you can't then pick, again, I know Phil sort of said this anyway because it's in the rule, but you can't then pick from another category that you have access to. It has to be the same category. That's very important.
Yes, that's true. I have misspoken. I've just double checked. It says if you do generate one that you've already generated, then generate another from that category. So you do have to roll for that one. It's just if you can't achieve one, then you get to pick. There is a bit of a weird nuance on that because this specifically says if you can't achieve it based on the keyword specified, there are some objectives which you can't achieve, but they don't reference keywords. But that's only one or two here or there, so that's a bit of an exception to the rule. But for the most part, it should be doable.
Yeah, I think most people, if under those circumstances, will meet you in the middle and allow you to re-roll it, or maybe they'll just be like, "Oh, mate, yeah, sure, sounds fair enough. Just pick something that you can do." Because I assume a lot of people are pretty flexible with that stuff, especially with the majority of people who are going to be playing this being friends playing it in a much more, matey pally capacity and less, try hard competitive potentially. Who knows?
Yeah. So I guess as an example of one of the objectives on this, so number 1, which is always the high scoring, it's for 8-pointer. You've got tear down their heroes. At the end of the turn, score 8 victory points if an enemy unit that has that had the highest power rating of units in your opponent's army that were on the battlefield that turn was destroyed that turn. Bit wordy, but basically if you destroy the unit that has the highest power level during that turn, then you get your 8 victory points.
There you go. So that big Knight Castellan, if you kill it in a oneer, bam.
Yeah, I think my favourite one on this was Crippling Blow, which I drew against you yesterday, and that's basically...
You're not going to go through all of them. Probably we don't need to go through all of them.
I think if we went through literally every single one, we'd be here all day. I think if we do 2 from each, like the number 1er, because that's the 8-pointer, and then one of the others.
I'm cool with that.
Crippling blow. At the end of any phase, score 5 victory points. If a model from your army made an attack that phase that caused an enemy vehicle or monster model with a damage table to move down to a lower row on their damage table. When this tactical objective is generated, if there are no enemy vehicle or monster models with a damage table that has not already been destroyed, or as such, models are already on the lowest row of the damage table, generate a new tactical objective from this category instead.
That was an interesting one, right? Because your Eradicators managed to kill my Hemlock in 1 round of shooting, but my Hemlock was on 11 wounds because it had previously suffered the perils of the warp and had mortal wounded itself. And then Phil proceeded to blow it up in 1 round of shooting. And then I raised the humorous question of, yeah, well, you didn't bracket it, you just killed it. It was healthy, and now it's dead.
I do feel like they maybe need to explicitly state that if you also reduce it to 0 wounds, it does the same thing. That's clearly what it does. And I guess the argument is actually if you, unless you're a Shadow Sword, you're not technically killing it in 1 turn. It's like one of my Eradicators would have bracketed it because you're doing fast dice. If you were to break it out, one of my Eradicators knocked it down a profile, another one knocked it down again, and then the last one killed it. It's probably how it goes. But yeah, I feel like with these sorts of wording, they do need to just be really specific about that, because some people would be like, "Oh, I think you're fine. You didn't take it down a bracket."
I mean, to be clear, just in case anyone thinks I was trying to be the person that Phil just did an impression of. No, I wasn't. I was Richie, who was with us. He was giving it a good go, but he was fighting my corner hard, more than I needed him to in some respects. But it was, it was obviously intended as a bit of a joke and exploiting the fact that there's clearly a bit of an obvious mistake in the way that. Yeah, exactly. But again, it's beta rules, right? And these are the sorts of things you can flag. One other thing I wanted to say, Phil, with regard to the unachievable tactical objective thing, there's a potential interesting gameplay in there around the fact that if keywords are off the battlefield, so you could potentially kind of lure your opponent into thinking that maybe you've got lots of characters that could be killed, and then you could put them in transports and then end up in a situation where your opponent is rolling for stuff, but because the characters are in transports now, they're not considered to be on the battlefield, therefore they can't achieve that tactical objective, therefore they need to choose something else.
Yes, well, so there's an interesting stratagem which does allow you once per game to change one of your categories. So I kind of like this, that if you do think, I've picked really badly, that there's a bit of a compromise that you can switch it out. And that's something you don't really get in kind of the current secondary.
They thought of everything, Phil.
Well, I think they've done a pretty good job.
So the next of the tactical objectives, Philip, is Raid. Storm the enemy lines. Not to be confused with the popular film about that fella trying to escape or enter some kind of prison building. It's been a long time since I've watched Raid. I just remember it was a lot of fighting in a prison, right?
Basically.
Yeah.
Tower block, wasn't it? Was it prison?
Yeah, tower block. It wasn't even a prison, was it? It sort of felt like a prison because it was run by a mob or something. But it merges with Dread. Anyway, let's not Dread as in, like, for a sense of foreboding, just the film. Anyway, Dread 3D, you know what I'm talking about. Right, Raid. So if you rolled a 1 or used a stratagem or, got to pick the number 1 for Raid, you would have Overwhelming Assault. And that is, at the end of the battle round, score 8 victory points if you control 2 or more of the objective markers within your opponent's territory. So if you're playing a smaller game, that's all the objective markers in your opponent's territory. And if you are playing one of the Strike Force or bigger games, it's possibly slightly more doable. But it is quite hard to imagine getting into your enemy territory and controlling 2 of their objectives. But you only need to do it at the end of the turn. At the end of the battle round. But if you were going second, maybe there's a way that you could work that easier. But yeah, it does seem quite tough to do. But 8 victory points, so not a bad one.
No, it's not too bad. Just to clarify, all of these are to do with, obviously it's raiding. It's all to do with grabbing objectives in your opponent's deployment zone, predominantly.
That is true. Sorry. I read out the flavor text.
Sometimes it's destroying an enemy unit that's in their deployment zone, but it's all to do with stuff in your opponent's deployment zone or player area, I think.
territory or whatever it's
Yeah.
called. Yeah. So in addition, seeing as we've agreed that we will only talk about one other, I guess I'll talk about Push Them Out, because that's quite an interesting one. At the end of the battle round, score 5 victory points if you control an objective marker within your opponent's territory. That isn't interesting at all. That's not the one I thought it was.
No, you want to retake out on Take and Hold, probably.
Yeah, probably.
Just
Take and
because
hold.
there's an error on it.
Oh, yes, there is, isn't there? So there are 2 versions of Take and Hold, depending on what mission type you're playing. So if you're playing an incursion game, it reads, at the end of the battle round, score 5 victory points if you control either objective marker 1 within your territory or objective marker 2 within your opponent's territory.
Yeah, so the thing that's wrong with this one is it says you can score a point either if you control objective marker 1 that's in your territory, that is not raiding, or objective marker 2 within your opponent's territory, that is raiding. Basically, holding the line is another category, and it's almost like exactly the same but mirrored. It's all to do with holding territory, and with that one, you can have to control either objective marker 1 within your territory or objective marker 2 within your territory. This is something Richard, when he was watching our game, pointed out. He believes, and I think he's correct, that there's a mistake on this one, and it should be objective marker 1 within your opponent's territory instead of in your territory. So that's some feedback to Tippity Tap to the Forge World. No, not Forge World. 40k FAQ.
Feedback, Q&A,
Feedback.
Whatever it's called.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, and why it gets extra weird, is because when you look at it at Strike Force / Onslaught, it reads at the end of battle round, score 5 victory points if you control objective marker 3 within your opponent's territory. So now, to the best of my understanding, the way it works with Strike Force and Onslaught, you can only control objective marker 3 in order to get this. But for incursion, you can control your opponent's objective marker 1 or 2, right?
Yeah, because there's only 2 objectives, I guess.
And the game's
that
smaller.
Makes it, yeah, so
Yeah.
if it makes sense doing it that way.
There you go. So that's interesting. What's the next one, Bill?
So the third one is Territory Seizure. Seize ground and deny it to the foe. So the first one, number 1, take it back. At the end of the turn, score 8 victory points if you control an objective that your opponent controlled at the start of the turn, which is quite a cool one. A bit difficult, obviously, because it's the 8-pointer, but really nice. And for
what other one would you talk about?
Let's see. Let's do Dominate. Again, this one's number 6. It's got a 2-parter, so there's the incursion version. At the end of a battle round, score 5 victory points if there are 2 or more quarters of the battlefield that each have 1 or more units from your army, excluding aircraft, wholly within them, and those units are outside engagement range of an enemy unit or units. So what I like about this one is you've got to have 2 units in 2 separate quarters and just not be in close combat, which I think in a small game is a lot harder to do than the larger game. So the Strike Force and Onslaught version is at the end of the battle round, score 5 victory points if there are 3 or more quarters of the battlefield that each have 1 or more units from your army, excluding aircraft, wholly within them and also outside engagement range of enemy units. So I like this. It's like you can't just be in a quarter. It's like you've got to be in a quarter and sort of be free to do whatever you want because you're not in combat.
Yeah,
So
where this is slightly easier to achieve than the GT, what's it called? Engage on all fronts. That's the words I was trying to find. Where this is slightly easier than engage on all fronts is not the same stipulation around being within 6 of the center of the board. So it is feasible that you could have, units occupying the center. They have to be 3 individual units and they have to be in each quarter. But if you had a trio of characters, you could very easily, ding them around the center, which is quite interesting. So if you had certain types of builds or certain things that you could do, then you could possibly do this easier than you might be used to. But at the same time, because it's random whether or not you're going to get this, it's very difficult to game it. So it's not like in the normal secondaries where you go, I'm going to take this specific secondary knowing that I'm going to get it every turn. And I've built this specific cheese around exploiting that and guaranteeing myself getting a volume of points based on that. So in this instance, it's actually quite interesting how that works.
Yeah, and what I like about these dynamics is you both roll for the objectives at the start of the battle round, so you know what your opponent's got. It's not hidden in any way. And you've got to, there's the tactical edge of you've got to deny what your opponent's doing and also achieve what you're doing at the same time. So there are ones also within Territory Seizure where you've got to get your Warlord within 6 inches of the center. There's another one where it's like no enemy units can be within the center. So there's a lot, especially if you're rolling on the same table, where you can like deliberately be conflicting over similar things. And it's like, cool, I can achieve this thing, but for me to do that, I'm actually denying you your one as well. So it's like a sort of doubling down on how you might be scoring this stuff.
Yeah. Holding the line, the next of the things. A successful defense yields no ground to the enemy. So myself and Phil, when we played a Maelstrom mission last night, we didn't do hold the line or heroic deeds or whatever the last one's called. I can't remember right now.
Eradication.
Thank you. I knew you would get there quickly. So this is all new, I suppose, to us because we've read it, but maybe not quite processed it in the same way, or at least I haven't. Maybe Phil has. But yeah, number 1 is targets held. At the end of the battle round, score 8 victory points, as is tradition for Objective 1 on the tactical objective tables. Score 8 victory points if your opponent does not control any of the objective markers within your territory. Tough to do, but, potent, right?
Well, not tough to do in Battle Round 1. Like Battle Round 2, maybe. It depends on what your army is. Like this, so holding the line is all about stuff, holding objectives, holding ground in your deployment zone. So if you're a guard player or a tower player, this is almost like a go-to auto pick. But then if you're up against, say, a Blood Angels army or Harlequins that are like super fast moving, then it's actually going to be quite hard to do some of these.
But even then, though, right, with the positioning of the objectives, there are ways that you can try and deal with this, right? Because it's theoretically possible that if you place an objective, if your territory is, let's use the 44 let's use a 4-foot range because it's just easier to talk in those terms. If 2 foot of the board is your territory, so if 2 foot by 6 foot is your territory, well, there's nothing stopping you from putting the objective marker more or less on the 2 foot line. So with deployment zones and other bits and pieces, and bear in mind, actually, there's nothing stopping you putting it on the 2 foot line, one side of the border or the other, noting the stipulations around the quantities that need to reside where they need to be and so on and so forth. But you could definitely position an objective marker in, close to the center, which would make it theoretically doable that you could start to get aggressively onto your opponent's objective markers early doors because you as a player have control over the placement. So with these kind of things in mind, you can start to place objectives to give you better chances of achieving these things.
Yes, yeah, because if you're going to go for a raid, for example, and need to get your opponent's objectives, you could, and for example, you were the defender, you could deliberately pick an objective or place an objective, as you said, just off of the center line. And then you go, cool, I'm picking the other side. So now, rather than being 24 inches away from an objective, I'm sort of 12 and a bit inches away from an objective that I could much easily get to early doors. There's lots of nuances around how you can do those.
Yeah, and also with these kind of things in mind, you can be really disruptive. I think one of the things that, we haven't really seen yet because we haven't played enough of it just yet, but that interaction of placement of objectives and what that means to both players is super interesting because the way it's worded and the way it works, just because Phil might be like, right, I want this side, so I'm going to start placing objectives on this side. All of a sudden I could do the nonsense of being like, Phil's placed his first objective on that side, so I'm going to do the same side as what Phil just did, just to muck him around and just be like, sure, I'm putting that there because I know you don't want that to be there.
Well, and then you're going, a valid tactic, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It just adds a little extra flavor. And just because I don't know which of these tactical objectives I'm going to pick, I'm going to roll this D6 here. and get a 6. Ironically, we always seem to be doing 1s and 6s, but hey, don't argue with the dice. Fallback position. If you're playing the incursion variant, at the end of the battle round, score 5 victory points if you control either objective marker within 1 of your territory or objective marker 2 within your territory. Sounds familiar.
It's exactly the same, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And if you're doing this in Strike Force or Onslaught variant, you need to control objective marker 3 within your territory. So there you go. Tell us about the heroic deeds, Phil.
The greatest warriors perform deeds that change the face of the battle. So number 1, cut off the head. This might sound familiar to someone. At the end of the turn, score 8 victory points if the enemy warlord was destroyed at that turn.
Hang on a second here, Phil. The warlord counting for something in a game?
Exactly. Quite
unbelievable.
Interesting. Yeah, so this one is all about predominantly characters killing stuff. There's one for psychic abilities as well. In fact, I'll read that one out because it is a bit different. So actually, I'll just read out 2 just because this one's a bit more nuanced than some of the others. So, for example, Savage Duel, which is number 3. At the end of a phase, score 5 victory points if a character model from your army made any attacks that phase that caused the enemy warlord to lose 1 or more wounds. There's one also for a character killing a character, and a character that attacked a unit that and it also performed a charge or heroic intervention that turn. But burn them out. Incursion and strike force level. At the end of your psychic phase, score 5 victory points if psychic powers manifested by a psychic unit from your army caused enemy units to suffer a combined total of 5 or more mortal wounds that phase. And then onslaught, you basically get 5 victory points if you manage to cause a total of 8 or more mortal wounds that phase, which sounds pretty steep unless you're like a Grey Knights or Thousand Suns.
Yeah, I mean, to do 5 mortal wounds in a turn is not normal. Like, you can build certain things that do it, but like your average Space Marine librarian is not gonna, smash out 5 mortal wounds.
I guess the assumption is if you've got 2 psychic characters and you're doing both smites, on average you should do 5 mortal wounds. Or actually, no, technically you'd probably on average do 4 because you're doing D3 each, aren't you?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, on average, I'd say you do 2.
Yeah, because you got to put it off first.
You got to pass 2 psychic tests, 1 on a 5, then on a 6.
Yeah, and potentially be denied, and then you've got to roll your damage and stuff. So, yeah, I think this one's quite hard to do.
I think it's really hard. I mean, I understand that it can't be easy because then it becomes a little bit silly. Because if they just said you get 5 victory points for doing 1, I'd be like, no, that's a bit much.
I think 4 is a good number because you can't just do it with 1 psychic power. You've got to do it with 2, but it gives you a bit of a redundancy of if you're being a bit rubbish. I mean, on average in our game yesterday, I think at one point you definitely did about 4 mortal wounds in a turn. I don't know if you did 5, maybe.
And that was, I think maybe there was one instance. I mean, I have a bad habit of once I cast Smite, only rolling a D3 in a 1 or a 1 on a D3. So it doesn't ever tend to really get that powerful for me. But I don't know, man. Like, I mean, I had a lot of Smite in my army yesterday. I mean, I had 4 characters that could do Smite or 4 things that could do Smite.
Yeah.
So I had the Wraithseer, the Hemlock, the Spirit Seer, and Eldred Ulfran. And yeah, I don't feel like there were too many instances where I felt comfortable doing 5 mortal wounds a turn with that.
No,
but then
most of the time you're doing psychic powers that aren't smite. So I guess if you rolled it, you would probably go, I'm just smiting everything.
Yeah. So I mean, I suppose if I took Executioner on my Farseer, it'd be more likely. But even then, it's still, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think 4 is maybe the sweet spot, as you say. But maybe, bizarrely, 3 feels like the sweet spot for me. But that's possibly too easy. So 4 probably is the sweet spot, really. And
also going off piece, I'm going to do Apply Tactics as well because it's so weird At the end of the phase, score 5 victory points if a model from your army made any attacks that phase that destroyed an enemy unit, and that model or its units have been affected by a stratagem. For example, it was selected for a stratagem or a stratagem that was used when the unit was selected to fight or shoot that you used early in the turn. So you've got to kill a unit that had a stratagem applied to it.
By me or by you?
Yeah, that's the interesting one on wording. If a model from your army made any attacks of that phase that destroyed an enemy unit, and that model or its units has been affected by a stratagem.
So
now,
so it's your unit that is.
I believe so. Yeah, it must be, because there's
Right.
very few units, very few stratagems that affect your opponent's unit.
So my unit has been given +1 to wound stratagem or fight twice stratagem or whatever stratagem, and that has resulted in killing something.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. God,
Which
that is
cool,
wordy.
but it's very niche. I think some armies will maybe be better at doing that one.
Oh yeah, Space Marines.
Yeah, I'll sort of say right away, I don't think this category is very good. Because 2 of them require your opponent to have a warlord, of which one of them is you got to kill the warlord. The other one you couldn't then do because the warlord's dead. Like, all the other objectives are pretty much repeatable because it's like to do with objectives or killing units. This one requires pretty much characters to do something, which characters killing units is doable, but not always, depending on what type of faction you've got. And then 2 of them are about your opponent's warlord, which are pretty much one-offs. I mean, in theory, you could do the one where you've got to do 1 or more wounds against warlord several times. And then, one of them's to do with psychics, which you might, if you rolled that one, you'd probably be repicking because you might not have any psychics in your army.
Yeah. Well, it's unlikely that you would take that table if you didn't have a lot of characters, and certainly no psychers as well. But I mean, again, very odd. The last of the tables is eradication, which is one of those moments in terms of the flavor text where I don't know why, but it's one of those moments where you read the words, but for the first time in a while, you actually hear them, if you know what I mean. So the flavor text for this is: the enemy numbers are overwhelming. They must be slaughtered. It's like, wow, okay, crikey. I mean, I understand that 40k is a bit grim and a bit dark, but sometimes it's like,
they must be.
A bit. Yeah, exactly. We're dealing in a few absolutes here, I feel.
Exactly. Harness your inner Black Templars.
Clearly. They all must be slaughtered, damn it. Anyway, well, even that guy, yes, everyone slaughtered to the last. Okay. Anyway, hit them hard is over
the head.
Objective number 1. I'm assuming, I haven't read this yet, by the way, spoilers, but I'm assuming this is all to do with killing hordes of enemies, but let's discover.
Yeah.
Hit them hard. If you're playing Incursion, at the end of your turn, score 8 victory points if 2 or more enemy units were destroyed this turn. And if you're playing Strike Force or Onslaught, at the end of your turn, score 8 victory points if 3 or more enemy units were destroyed this turn. So kill a lot of stuff and get rewarded for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Seems to be hard.
Yes. I mean, well, depends, doesn't it? I mean, ultimately, if you're up against an army with lots and lots of little bits, then maybe not, but depends. It really depends on what you're up against. I mean, hordes are destined to still be the best thing in 40k. I strongly believe that. So maybe this could be interesting for those interactions. I'm going to choose Expunge the Witch because it is different and it involves psychers. At the end of the turn, score 5 victory points if an enemy psyker was destroyed this turn. Nice and simple. Yeah. So kill a psyker, get 5 points. There's Break Their Will, which has differing stipulations dependent upon the size of game you're playing. Incursion, Strike Force, and Onslaught are all individually listed here. But essentially, it won't come as any surprise. It's all to do with morale. At the end of the morale phase, score 5 victory points if 3 or more enemy models were destroyed during that phase. I mean, wow.
That's for Incursion. For Strike Force, which is a standard game, you need 6. How often does that happen?
I mean,
this shows you the inner workings of Games Workshop of how important they think the morale phase is. I don't think you're really killing more than 2 or 3 on average.
Yeah, I mean, the morale phase is so neutered at the moment. I mean, it was practically worthless in 8th edition. In 9th edition, it's just an absolute waste of time. The only thing that's good about the changes they've made to the morale system in 9th edition is they've removed a lot of the things, or at least initially it felt like they removed a lot of the things that made you auto pass morale.
Yeah, sure.
But now we're in a situation where they're just giving it all back again. It's like, oh, flipping heck. Like, it's just, everyone seems to have a way of not worrying about morale.
Oh, yeah.
And even if they are worrying about it, who cares? It's like, oh, did I lose one model? Oh, what a terrible shame. Nothing else happens. Because, yeah, I mean, sometimes it does, I admit, but not to the tune of 5 models in a 1,000-point game.
No, I know, yeah. So there's also, cut off the head of a serpent is killing a character. There's another one which is you kill a certain number of models. So for decimation on a strike force, you've got to kill 20 models in a phase. It's all, they say, it says at the end of any phase, if you score points, you score 5 victory points. If attacks made by models from your army destroyed 20 models or more, that phase, like if that was the battle round, like for your turn, I'd be like, fair enough. But 30 models, 30's onslaught, incursions 10, strike forces 20.
I mean, you think about your average strike force game at the moment. Again, this is clearly built around hordes, but if you think about your average strike force game, I mean, most people's armies are only like 30 models. So, that'd be a heck of a push.
Yeah.
But obviously, you're not going to take this table if you're playing against that. That's the thing we've got to remember.
I guess, yeah.
I mean, to be fair, Phil, it's really easy, or it used to be really easy, and it has been really easy in the past to kill 50 or so little guardsman units in a turn if that's what your opponent's brought en masse, right?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. If you're like guard or tout and your only phase predominantly is going to be the shooting phase, then this is probably doable. But if your army's up against Space Marines, though, you're not going to kill 20.
Well, you're not going to pick this, are you? You're just not going to pick it.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that's the point that I feel like we're overlooking at this point. This is not for when you're playing against the Custodes. This is for when you're playing against
you're
the
right.
orcs.
And then the last one is you score 5 victory points if attacks made by a vehicle or monster destroyed 1 or more enemy units that phase. So actually, as a guard player, that one's really good.
I love how quickly you've started to ignore your initial stipulation around we're not saying everyone.
Well, that is the thing. I think the first 3 or 4 categories, like they've all got a very similar theme to them, whereas these ones are a bit more all over the place.
They add some flavour.
Yeah.
It's not just you changing your mind midway through.
Certainly not. How dare you?
Certainly not. How dare you, sir? How dare you? Anyway, there you go. So look, you selected tactical objectives. We're going back to the chain of events.
Yeah.
We've selected tactical objectives. So for the case of an alpha, beta, and gamma, I have decided that I will go with recon, there's
no such thing as recon.
Sorry, not recon. Sorry, I'll go with brought low, raid, and territory seizure, and then Phil will probably have done the same. And then
exactly
we'll move
like
on to
yesterday.
step 11.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Declare reserves and transports. Standard 40k stuff right now, right?
Yes, yeah. Then you deploy armies, which is kind of going back to ye olde times, where starting with defender, you place your models in your deployment zone, but you alternate deployment. They specifically call out if your model's too large, it doesn't fit in the deployment zone. But yeah, basically you just you're just alternating deployment, which I'm not a huge fan of. I sort of get it, but it's like, please stop it, Games Workshop, with the alternating deployment.
It's awful.
Because I think, as we said before, the way the final iteration of Maelstrom worked before was pretty good with the whole. And I don't know if this is partly because they've sort of changed the rules around like rolling off, and now it's like you win the roll off, you're going first. Whereas this is and we're going into it in the next step, determining the first turn, you roll off, the winner gets to pick.
Yeah.
So it feels like it's got all the worst sort of deployment aspects of the roller gets to pick. The roller gets to pick deployment zones. You alternate deployment, and the winner of the determining first turn gets to pick. So that can all be gamified slightly, whereas I think how it sort of was historically, where you deploy your whole army, but then the other person gets to deploy second and then go first or something, is probably a better way of going about it.
Phil, you're stealing my rant, or have I imprinted on you enough over the years now? You started to agree with me when it comes to
I'm on the damn
deployment
train.
Mate,
Yeah.
it's the place to be. I don't understand how any of the rules writing staff at Games Workshop haven't gotten their head around how best to do deployment.
Well, I will say though, alternating deployment when we did Incursion yesterday was perfectly fine. I really liked it. There was a bit of tactical nuance. It's like, oh, where's your fly going? Where's my eradicators going? But on a larger game, I just think it's so sort of unwieldy and time consuming that you just need to plonk those armies down as quick as possible.
Yeah, because it's funny that you said that, because I wasn't doing any of that. I just put stuff wherever I felt like I wanted it to be, and I just whatever.
Well, yeah, and again, I think we said it before. Like sometimes you know where your army's going to go. It's like, cool, this unit needs to hide behind this wall. This unit needs to be on an objective, regardless of what your opponent does. There is some sort of firing lanes and angles that you do want to consider for certain units, but certainly not for your whole army, and it just sort of slows it down. Step 14.
I mean, at this point, we're now going through the basic structure of a game, right? So it's resolve pre-battle abilities, begin the battle, end the battle, determine a winner, right?
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting about determine the winner is they specifically say you cap victory points at 90, and obviously if you've got battle-ready army, you get those extra 10. But there's, unlike the kind of current secondaries, there's no categories of like points. So your 90 points can be made up of whatever of the three ones you picked, because quite often you're sometimes rolling randomly, so you don't know. So I like that it's just a nice, easier way of, like, there's less bookkeeping involved when you're final scoring. All the scoring's done at the end of the battle round. There's no scores being done like as a holdover from your turn in your next command phase or anything like that. So it actually makes playing the game so much more simpler, but in a good way.
And as with the normal situation in 9th edition 40k, it's a 5 battle round game, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then, the last thing I think we need to talk about is stratagems, which are specific to the Maelstrom of the War. So there's fixed determination, which is 1 CP. So use a stratagem at the start of battle round before you generate any tactical objectives. Select one that you've generated previously, and basically you get to keep that rolled over to the next battle round, and it counts towards your limit that you have for that battle round.
And the specific order with that is that you should still roll as a player, but once you've satisfied the criteria, i.e. you then have 3 objectives, you stop rolling. So me and Phil, when we played this yesterday, we agreed that you didn't need to roll at first, but actually the way you're supposed to do it is roll until you've got up to 3. So that's the technical way of approaching it, right, Phil?
Yeah, for sure. And these are all like 1 CP stratagems as well.
Strats, yeah.
Do you want to do the next one, which is new intel?
I could do new intel. Use the stratagem at the end of the battle round. Select one of the tactical objective categories that you selected for your army at the start of the battle. You can replace it with one of the categories that you did not select. You can only use this stratagem once per battle. So you're not enjoying the territory seizure. Perhaps you want to raid. Thus, you can do so for but 1 CP. Personally, I think that's powerful in-game to the point that it feels like it should be a 2 CP strat. But I think the 1 use per game somewhat mitigates that situation.
Yeah, and I think you don't want to necessarily penalise smaller games like for Incursion, where you've only got 6 command points. So I think 2 is maybe a bit...
So much of what they've done in the rules up to this point is make stipulations for different sizes. So maybe it could be a 1/2, depending on game size. But Either way, it's not game breaking. It just, but it could offer you some tactical flexibility, or maybe not. Maybe I'm overly rating it, but anyway.
Well, again, when I said the one about killing your warlord, if you've done that, you might go, I need to change to a different category because I'm not getting much out of this one. So I like that kind of flexibility, and it's not penalising you if you picked badly because you've not played against a certain opponent, so you just chose the wrong one. Whereas the current GT mission pack, I sort of feel like if you picked a secondary in it, you picked poorly, you're kind of stuck with it for the game, and you're kind of fighting an uphill battle.
Agreed.
The next one is quick thinking. So use this stratagem at the start of the battle round when you have rolled to generate a tactical objective. So specifically after you've done it, add 1 to the roll or subtract 1 from the roll. You cannot use a stratagem to change the roll to a tactical objective that you have already generated this battle. You can only use it. You can only use a stratagem once per battle round.
Not bad. I mean, again...
Yeah, it basically is a bit... This is where the sort of deck tailoring comes in even more so than just picking a category. If you know... If you get a bad pick, basically, you go, oh, I can do this one, but it's going to be super hard. 1 CP, you can choose one of the ones above or below that might be a bit more tailored for you. And I like the fact that you've got to spend CP to do it because that's like a finite resource, but it's worth doing.
It's weird, though, as well, just to say that there is this situation where you roll, you go 1 higher or 1 lower, because if you roll a 6 or a 1 and you don't want that, you can only go in one direction. And I feel like there should have been maybe some kind of stipulation there that maybe if you rolled a 6, you're allowed to go down 2 or up 2 if you rolled a 1. Just to alleviate some of the flex with that. Because I feel like it's that thing where it's like, again, okay, fair enough. If you roll a 2, you can make it a 1 or a 3, and that's fair enough. But if you roll a 1, you've only got a choice between 1 and 2. So that stratagem becomes less valuable than if it were that you rolled a 3.
True. Exactly. Yeah. I imagine this would almost be like if, for example, this was a deck game, it would be draw 3 cards, pick 1, as opposed to the sort of up and down mechanic, which is very much inherent with a table that you're rolling on.
Yeah. But it's not a card game anymore, Phil. It's a table.
It is.
So there we are. And standing orders, the last of the stratagems. Basically, pay 1 CP, and you get to pick the number 1. So as we've established, number 1 is always worth 8 on every table. So pay 1 CP and you get that. Or officially sounding, use the stratagem at the start of the battle round when you have rolled to generate a tactical objective. Change the roll to a 1. You cannot use the stratagem if you have already rolled a 1 when generating a tactical objective for a category this battle round. You can only use the stratagem once per battle round. Important.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is the very first one, fixed determination, doesn't stipulate that you can only use it once per battle round, which implies that, for example, if you had 3 objectives that you didn't do but want to achieve the following turn, you could spend 3 CP and roll them all over.
Yeah, theoretically. Although, again, technically, you're using these stratagems at the start of the battle round, and I feel like they've stipulated now, haven't they, that if it's only once per game, that they're very specific in their language moving forward.
Well, I think the limit of a stratagem being once per a phase is a match play thing, which I guess...
But aren't these technically match play rules?
Well, this is where we're getting a bit tricky, because normally that's in the GT pack, for example, which this
it's not always in the GT pack. There's match play in the rulebook.
Yeah, so maybe it would fall under that, and then this is a bolt-on to that. But normally those rules, they do sort of reiterate here, which they haven't done. Unless I'm thinking it wrong.
Maelstrom is specifically stipulated in the rulebook as a match play rule set.
Oh, okay.
Just to say, it's listed there under... It's listed in the rulebook, if I remember correctly. I've made that statement very boldly and very self-assured. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's a match play. Either way, whatever. It's Maelstrom. Who cares?
Well, exactly. What's good about those two? So the quick thinking and standing order stratagem, what's good is you can do that after your roll. So you've got a 1 in 6 roll of getting something you might like. You can then opt to up it or lower it by 1 or make it a 1. So you have a lot of flexibility of almost choosing your objective if you want to spend your CP resource into it, which is pretty cool.
Do you know, Phil, in order for you to score the maximum 90 points, you need to have rolled a 1 or used this stratagem to get a 1 every turn at least. So you have to have at least had and scored every secondary every turn. So if you only got
3 8s every,
well, you got to get at least 1 8 a turn in addition to your
so you got to be doing 18 points a turn.
You have to do at least 18 points a turn to get the 90. Yeah,
that's pretty good.
And yeah, so it's tough going to get 90 points in this game.
Yeah,
system,
what
sure.
what I like about there's like a bit more granularity in the victory points. So before, if you score when it was 1 and D3, for example, that D3 could be worth double or triple the value of a normal objective, tactical objective. Whereas here, it's only like 20% better. It's not double. It stops you having a runaway lead, basically. And like when we played yesterday, it was it 20? I mean, we didn't do a full game. We just did like 3 turns, I think. And it was like 25-23. And it was like super close. Whereas I think turn 2, I was like almost, it felt like I was having a runaway lead. I was like on 10 and you were on 3 or something. Well, no, it couldn't be 3. It was either 8 or 5.
I think you were on 8 and I was on 0.
Yeah, it was something like that. I was like, initially I was like, oh, I'm sort of, in the lead, but you caught up quite easily, which I think ultimately makes for a tighter, closer game, which is always.
Oh, totally. I mean, and I suppose we'll get to our impressions in a moment. Let's just finish up by going through the different missions, right? So we've already talked about mission 1, territorial control. Let's quickly talk about ambitious surge. So this is the second of the missions. You select your tactical objective categories, alpha, beta, gamma, as per the mission that we've already spoken about. That is to say that you roll a D3. If you roll a 1, it's alpha. 2, beta, 3, gamma. Generate tactical objectives is as per the standard, i.e. you roll the D3 and then you roll the corresponding D6, use any stratagems, or make a decision based on your inability to perform whatever it is that you've ended up rolling. And the mission rule is ambitious surge. At the start of the battle round, after tactical objectives have been generated, the player attempts to guess each other's battle plans. Starting with the player who had the first turn, each player selects one of the objective generated by their opponent. If their opponent scores that tactical objective this battle round, they score twice as many victory points for it. Ooh.
Yeah, it's a bit weirdly worded, this one, because it implies you've got to guess, but none of these are secret. So what you have to do is pick one of your opponents that you think is really hard to do, because they will get double points if they do it. So you're like, I'm making this one more valuable for you to do, so I don't want to make it too easy for you. So that's how that one works, which is quite cool. It's a nice little
it's a nice mind game, right? Because again, it adds an element of control to the gameplay, and it allows you as a player to effectively, lay down a challenge to your opponent. And depending on the type of gamer you are, depending on the type of gaming group that you're playing in, some people will seek to rise to this challenge, irrespective of the suicidal odds that lay ahead of them. Yeah. And others will be like, well, that's nice, but no thank you.
But there's definitely some nice elements to this one where, for example, you can honey trap one of your opponent's objectives, because if they did that, it then makes achieving some of yours a bit easier. So it's like they're deliberately not going for the objective that will take you off one of yours, which might score you one of your tactical objectives, but instead you go over there to the center of the battlefield and score that one for more points because I want to score this one over here, for example. So
yeah.
There's some nice nuances to that one.
What about complex front, Phil?
The complex front. So with this one, you don't split your objectives into categories like the alpha, beta, gamma. Instead, what you do at the start of the battle round when you're generating them, you generate one from each. So you're always generating one from each category, which I think is a nice little change from the random rolling. And then the mission rules.
I mean, you are still rolling for each of them, though, right?
Yeah. You're rolling on the table category, but you're not rolling to determine what the category is.
Correct, yeah.
So this mission rules is overriding orders. At the start of the battle, each player secretly selects one of their tactical objective categories and makes a note of it on their army roster. Each time they score a tactical objective from that category, they score an additional 5 victory points. Big money. The first time they do this, so they must reveal their selection to their opponent. So there's an initial secret, but once you've done it, you kind of show it to your opponent, which I like.
Yeah, I mean, again, I like the secret element at the start. I like the fact that there are some interesting extra nuances to what you're doing. And I like the fact that when your opponent is made aware of the fact that there are extra points on the table, that they are then able to adjust certain strategies or try and prioritize the more valuable objectives. So again, influences both players and is certainly interesting in terms of how it plays out in gameplay. Number 4 is subterfuge and interference. Again, selecting these is the traditional route, i.e. you have alpha, beta, gamma, and you roll D3 and roll D6, stratagem, so on apply. But the mission rules for subterfuge and sabotage is at the start of each battle round. After tactical objectives have been generated, players sabotage each other's orders, starting with the player who had the first turn. Each player selects one of the objectives generated by their opponent. Their opponent cannot score that objective this battle round, which is quite an obvious thing. So essentially, with the player who went first, player selects one of the objectives generated by their opponent and says you can't do it anymore. So if there is something there that would be otherwise easy for your opponent to do, you get rid of it. But equally, if there are other things that you want to try and achieve, you can easily take away something that might have been hard to do, meaning that your opponent will pursue the easy option. But again, you can have a potential layer of control over certain things that your opponent is seeking to do.
Yeah. So this time you're only doing 2 objectives per turn rather than the usual 3. And this is very similar to one of the old Maelstrom missions where you used to take a card out and stop your opponent from doing it. So I quite like this one. This one really levels the balance of the playing field, because those easy win ones you just sort of take out. So actually everything's a bit harder. So it stops runaway winners, basically.
Indeed.
Next one is quite interesting, chaotic engagement. So this time you don't select any tactical objective categories at all. Instead, when you generate them on the table. So there's a D6 table. Each one is one of the categories. So you can have one of any of the 6. And again, up to 3 times. So you could end up with a bunch of really random stuff. You can, however, use the mission rule, which is stubborn conviction. So players can use the fixed determination stratagem for 0 CP. So again, that one is the one where you can roll over an objective, but they've not really clarified if you can do that one multiple times then. Because if you could, for 0 CP, maybe that one could be gamed a bit where you're going, oh, I'm always rolling over my objectives. But then you're only going to do that if it's worthwhile.
Yeah. I mean, again, it depends on how you and your opponent agree. I think ultimately, I would interpret that you should only really be able to use that stratagem once, because I think, as you've already kind of indicated, there are some very obvious ways that you can make that very powerful. But ultimately, if you and your opponent are cool with that, then go crazy, right? I mean, at the end of the day, figure out it's not been specifically stipulated within the rules here, and it hasn't necessarily been clarified in these new beta rules whether this is considered match play or open or narrative. I think obviously it's not narrative, but it's certainly could be considered as a form of open play.
Well, what makes me think that you could do is every other stratagem specifically says you can only use it once per battle round or once per game. So the fact that this one doesn't have that stipulation makes me go, is that deliberately designed that way so you can do it multiple times? And maybe that's cool. Maybe that's useful. Like if you want to spend the CP on it, great. Obviously it makes it a bit harder, or easier in the chaotic engagement to roll stuff over if it costs 0 CP. So I think that's a nice balance between you've got no idea what you're going to get, but at least this way you can keep the ones that you think are worthwhile.
Yeah. And then lastly, we have Never Surrender, which has the traditional method for selecting your tactical objectives. D3 follows D6, stratagems apply, and the mission special rule is never give up. From second battle round onwards, at the start of each battle round, if one player has fewer victory points than their opponent, that player generates a fourth tactical objective that battle round.
So that's quite cool. It's benefiting the loser, basically. So again, another nice way of balancing the game, stopping runaway winners. Yeah.
No, really good. And again, something that just create some interesting, approaches between you and your opponent, create some other little sort of, strategic nuances, makes it just fun to see. So there you go, guys. That is our appraisal of the rules themselves. But what do we think about it? Phil, would you like to go first, or would you prefer to hear what I have to say?
No, I'll start off. Let's start off on a positive.
Please do.
I love it. I think it's not perfect. I do think there needs to be some rule tweaks, as we were saying, like the deployment zone, rolling off, things like that. I think obviously need to change slightly. They're not terrible though. What I really like about this is I think we did our test game on Tabletop Simulator. We did a small incursion, 1,000 points. By the second turn, and I'll preface this by saying I don't really like playing on Tabletop Simulator. You kind of normally got to drag me on there. Kicking and screaming, but by the second turn I was saying to myself, I bloody love this is good fun. Like, it's so much more enjoyable than a standard match play GT mission. You can replay the same mission and select the same sort of secondary same objective categories, and your games will be totally different, either because you've rolled off on a different mission. Your deployment would obviously be different as well because you roll for that. But just how the game plays in terms of generating new tactical objectives every single turn or battle round will just make it totally different. Whereas I feel like if you took the same army against the same opponent, rolled for a different mission, it's on a GT mission pack, you're ultimately going to have the same game. You might have different deployment zones, but you'll probably always pick the same secondaries, and the mission will play out very similar. Whereas I think you won't have that problem with this, because the ebb and flow of the game is a bit random, but the balance of the missions is still there.
I mean, look, from my side of things, mate, I genuinely can only echo your sentiments on this one. I think it's not the perfect version of Maelstrom. And I don't even necessarily feel like Chapter 2019 was the perfect version. I think there was some refinement, and there's some things that this does that I like more, and there's some things that Chapter 2019 did that I like more. But ultimately, for me, this is much more how I want to play 40k generally. GT has its place, and I think it's really important that I clarify this for a lot of people who listen to the show and, understand my relationship with tournament gaming, right? To clarify, 90% of the tournaments that I played in prior to 2020 were Eternal War tournaments, right? Like, I didn't really bother with the ITC until about 2020, and we all know how 2020 went. I didn't really get to play an awful lot of it. But I did embrace ITC probably around late 2019. I think I played my first ITC tournament structure in 2019. And I remember talking to the TO, Adam Shepherd-Jones, friend of the show at the time, going, mate, what is this? And he was like, it's ITC, mate. It's all the rage. And I'm like, yeah, but what do you mean? I got to pick. What? How does it work? What are you on about? Like, what is this? And, because I literally turned up to the tournament without reading the tournament pack. Ironically, I think I came third, despite the fact I didn't even know what I was doing. Maybe that speaks to the quality of the competition that were there that day, but I do think maybe there was some... I think actually it was more to do with the fact that the Elder were just that strong in 2019 that it's a bit crazy. But anyway, look, long story short, ITC and I have not always seen face-to-face throughout the course of 8th edition, and the Grand Tournament Pack is not what I want for my general games of 40k. Broadly speaking, I haven't enjoyed the Grand Tournament gameplay structure because it's just too samey. 40k isn't chess, and I don't want it to be. I've never wanted that for my game, for what I consider 40k to be. And though this isn't necessarily quite what I want it to be either, I prefer it to GT 2020.
Yeah.
Like, I would far sooner play you in a game of Maelstrom than playing a game of GT 2020, because at the end of the day, even when I win GT 2020 missions, I don't enjoy myself with it. I just sort of think to myself, yay, we went through the motions and I happened to have the more durable thing that exploited XYZ stipulation within the tournament structure or within the mission pack, and I was able to sit on the objective longer. Aren't I great? And it's like, that's not how I like to play the game. Like, the majority of my experiences of playing 40k is around those moment-to-moment tactical decisions, moment-to-moment like challenges. And I feel like some of the old Eternal missions did that perfectly, and I've always felt like Maelstrom does that really well. It presents me with a problem that I need to solve, and I am always engaged. My brain is always engaged in the game. Whereas I find with like the GT stuff, I've pretty much worked out turn one what my route to victory is, and I've just stuck to it.
Yeah,
and
this feels very much like an old sort of chapter approved mission. It felt like playing 8th edition 40k in a good way. Like, the actual missions felt more classic. What objectives are important, but they're not the be all and end all. It's like they're useful for some victory point scoring, but you don't have to hold it every single turn. You can kind of go off of it and go, well, as long as I don't roll to have to secure that objective, I can actually leave it for this turn. Or I might be near it to deny my opponent, but it's a risk and reward option. Every single battle round, you've got an interesting problem to solve of, these are my 3 things I've got to do. What's the best way of solving and achieving each and every one? Sometimes they combo up really well. So, I've got to kill a vehicle. I've got to kill a unit in your player area.
Territory.
So it's like, cool, I can double down and try and do maybe a harder target, but I'm killing 2 birds with 1 stone as opposed to killing 2 separate units that might be easier. But, there's lots of things like that. Whereas I feel like the GT missions are, what you're doing on a turn-by-turn basis is very repetitive. It's, I'm deploying scramblers here. I'm getting engaged on all fronts here. And I'm repeating that every single turn. And then I'm also on these objectives here.
And 9th edition, at this point has become an edition of, just blockers and attackers, in so much as essentially it's like, I mean, obviously to say it's like American football isn't fair, but because American football kind of resets and then you do new plays to each kind of instance that occurs within the game. Whereas with 40k at the moment, it's very much a case of, right, these are my territory grabbing units, and their objective is to go here and here, and then I have tailored my list in such a way that it synergizes with these secondaries, so as I can maximize this. I've tailored my list in this way so as I don't give away these secondaries. I've built in all these things that mean that I have a one-dimensional army. It's like, for example, right, like the Dark Angels army that I have built off the back of the Dark Angels Codex coming out is based off of an army that I used to run in 7th edition and for a little bit in 8th edition, but then kind of gave up on it in favor of just going after Elder stuff and all the rest of it. Plus Primaris were new and exciting back then, but I digress. The thing is, right, is like, that Dark Angel army was quite interesting in 7th edition and even in early 8th edition. In 9th edition, I've tried playing it a couple of times, and it's too versatile to be good. Like, anyone who's playing Dark Angels at the moment will tell you the competitive Dark Angel build is lots of Terminators, a good portion of which need to be Deathwing Knights. And it's like, that's just boring. It's like, oh, great, here's an unkillable thing. Try and have a go. Whereas, like, to me, an army that's got Ravenwing and Deathwing and, you know, vehicles and psychers and, you know, flavor, I feel like this mode of gameplay expresses that so much more, because my versatile selections, the things that I've put in my army, the fact that I've taken a variety of options is rewarded, and that I like.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean,
I like the fact that
I feel like with the the GT mission packs is you can kind of you build your army around the 3 objectives that you know you're pretty much going to pick all the time, or at least 1 or 2 of them, and then maybe 1 or 2 is based on what your opponent has. And it might be that because we've only just seen this, we've only played 1 game of it, you can tailor your army in a way where you know which of the 3 categories you're always going to be picking, although that I don't think that's always the case, because some of the missions is going to be randomly generated. So you're less inclined to tailor and optimize your army based on what you can score out of those categories, but also it's much harder to deny your opponent scoring their secondaries because everything's so random, and it's not based around having super durable units or having a cap on a number of psychers or number of vehicles, because there is no cumulative points for, like, oh, I'm just going to try and kill a tank, 3 tanks a turn to get my 15 victory point secondaries. Like, you can't do that in this. So I think it will create more varied list builds. It might be the categories aren't fairly weighted and that some are going to be easier to achieve than others. Like we did the first 3 ones, which was all about getting into your opponent's territory, getting into sort of on like objectives, and sort of moving around the board.
Killing vehicles, which was a huge mistake.
Killing vehicles and monsters, that was it. Yeah, but ultimately,
I should have moved out that category. But anyway, let's move.
You chose those 3 categories, and I was like, oh, umming and ahhing, and I was like, I'll just take the same ones because it'll be easier. And actually, we had a really fun, varied game. And that wasn't even sort of being strategic about it, but it sort of worked. I do think that the second 3 lots, the last 3 out of that set might be a bit harder and a bit more difficult to do. Although Hold the Line, I think, might be quite an easier one depending on your build. It'd be interesting to see if what they do with this, like how they balance them out, whether the internet sort of tries to break it by trying to present an optimized version of these are the 3 categories you always take depending on your faction, or if there even be specific ones later on.
I genuinely don't think that the internet will seek to break this, because I don't think the internet's interested. I think Maelstrom is a system that hopefully the majority of the online tournament community just stay away from. In a way, I love that this exists for people that just want to play fun games. And here's the thing, right? I love a tournament. I love competitive play, everything in its time and place. But for me, 40k shouldn't be defaulted to competitive play. If everyone out there is just playing the GT mission packs, you are playing a inferior version of 40k long term, because it's you're never going to find it entertaining like I found this entertaining. This, to me, was the most fun I've had in 9th edition 40k. Like 9th edition 40k has been really underwhelming to me until this came along. And it's crazy to say about 1 game, 1,000 points, tabletop simulator, all those things in conjunction. And I was still like, wow, I could get behind this. This is something that I'm looking forward to playing in my social gaming circles, as opposed to the tournament side of things. Now, there's always going to be people who are only going to want to play competitive GT style things, and that's fine. You accept that. But I hope that becomes a relative oddity as opposed to the standard. And I know, like, when I'm playing yourself and I'm playing Richie, Tim, any one of the people that I play on a regular basis, I'm sure we're going to probably default to this. But for a lot of the friends that I have who are predominantly preoccupied with tournament play, I'm sure I'm going to still have to play my fair share of GT, and that's fine. as long as I've got this to retreat to. I don't mind GT if it's not the exception, but if the load is shared equally between this and the GT pack.
Because you've got open play like Deck of Cards, which most people probably turn their nose up, but having seen some of the sort of mission options you can generate from that, I actually think that's probably that's a really good casual way of playing a game. Like if you're not doing tournament play, the open war deck I think is really good. I think this is a better supplement to that. So if you're doing regular casual games with your mates down the club or at your mate's house, I think Maelstrom should be the de facto way of playing, because I think it's a lot more interesting and fun. I think open war's a great way of doing it as well. If you want to lead more into a campaign style, obviously you've got Crusade. So I think all the choices are there, and I like the fact that this one's finally being presented to us as an alternative, because up until now most people are going, I'm just playing the GT mission packs as my casual games because I don't want to do open war. I'm not one of those people. I don't want to do Crusade because that seems like too much hard work, or I just don't understand it. So you've either got to do the standard core rulebook missions, which I don't think anyone ever really does because the GT mission pack came out at the same time. It's either that or the open war deck. So I think this now is a sort of third choice other than Crusade, so it's now 4 technically. But I think it'll be good. I think lots of people will enjoy playing it. I think I know a lot of people that speak really positive of it, but then that's because a lot of them either are tournament players or they're kind of sort of pseudo, like myself, a bit casual in terms of the tournament going player. So yeah, when you're home with your mates, I think this will be the way. This will be a winner, I think.
I totally agree, and I think that's the thing. It's like the problems with it are that it needs some game aids for sure. Like they need to do a card system to accompany this just for referencing, because it is cumbersome as it is, especially within the pages of a White Dwarf. I think if they release a PDF, that'll go some ways towards helping. But I think a card.
I think even if you could if each card just had your category on it. So at the beginning of the game, you take your 3 categories, you pop that down next to you. That is infinitely a great system. I think there is something to be said about the joy of deck building and the card aspect where you were drawing cards. I think there's something very fun and enjoyable of just that physical performance that this one lacks. But I also think it sort of just streamlines it a lot. And actually, when we were rolling to go which of my categories am I rolling, and then rolling on the tables, I think that actually is also quite enjoyable, but sort of a different sort of vibe to drawing the cards.
Yeah, I don't mind it. I think, again, it's just one of those things that, game aids for something like this, I think, are essential because it just streamlines that process a bit better. How that manifests itself is to be determined, but yeah, if either it's individual cards for those individual tactical objectives, or it's a card that gives you the overarching chart, and maybe then like a little simple piece of design is if maybe they did them in card, but they had like an indent or a recess or just a space where a hole where you could put your dice that indicates which of the tactical objectives that you've done. So maybe you could just place it in the top with the number facing upwards. And obviously to account for the weird instances where you could have as many as 3 or 4 of the same thing within the same category, I guess they could have like 4 indents or 5 indents in the thing to account for the strange instances where you will have accrued a lot of the same
because I think that in terms of the mental load when you're playing the game, trying to remember the different 3 objectives that you've got that turn, and then at the end when you need to score, that's like the only difficult thing you need to do. You've got to remember those 3 objectives. So either you've got to write them down, which is what we did. Sometimes it was quite easy, so I just remembered. Write them down, or if there's a counter you can put next to it, if you've got a physical printout of those tables, that would be really handy.
Yeah.
But I find that so much easier to do than playing the secondaries where you've got the kind of bookkeeping of each individual category of secondary. Whereas this, all your scores are 5 or 8 points. They go into your overall victory point pot. There's no separation of that out, so it's all nice and easy. You always score at the end of the battle round.
Yeah. The secondaries have got easier with time, but that's not because they're a better system. It's just that it's just familiarity. And I think the thing is that, I think as well, it probably is useful as players that when we, if we get some markers or some other things, that then also, if it's, say, cards, the thing I like about that as well is that you can place it next to the thing. So if you draw a card that stipulates you've got to kill the highest power rating unit, you can place the card by that unit. So all of a sudden so everyone is dialed in to what is happening. If you've drawn the card rolled for the tactical objective where you have to make sure that there are no models within 6 of the center of the board, we place that objective in that card in the middle of the board. So there's all these things that you can do with those kind of game aids that just make, again, the mental load of dealing with it much better. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you're playing this game is, anything that just alleviates that constant needing to remember what you're doing, but what your opponent's doing. But I think, again, that's where the fun is, because essentially you get that opportunity to wipe every battle round and then start afresh. And I don't know, I just like it more. I like the fact that the things I noticed that were happening in our game yesterday, movement was becoming more important. Units were becoming much more dynamic and much more active, and things were being, there were things that you wanted or things that you needed that you felt like, I can't just win this game by choking out these specific areas. I can't just win this game by doing one specific thing. I need to be tactically flexible. And to me, I think that's the best sign of a 40k player.
Yeah, I sort of strongly suggest, this is my kind of ending take, is that people go out, buy the White Dwarf magazine. You've got Maelstrom then to play for the next, however long you can play it until they do something with it. And I really do hope they will. I think there's been a large portion of players sort of crying out for Maelstrom, and were sort of sad to see it not reappear yet in 9th edition. I hope people go out and actually get some games in, feedback to Games Workshop, so hopefully when it does come out as a proper game mission pack, it will be even better.
Yeah, and again, I echo that sentiment. Please give it a go. I genuinely think you'll find it more enjoyable than you realise, or than you expect. It's a rewarding game system that actually probably deserves a fresh perspective from players. So, I highly encourage you to give it a go. And on that note, Phil, we may as well move on to the end of the show. Transitional noise. Woo! So, quite accidentally, but also sort of on purpose, now the outro is becoming much more an opportunity to do Q&As with the community, which is great because, in a way, it gives our, quote, rambling structure a bit more of an actual structure. Wouldn't you say so, Phil?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it like that, but you are quite right.
Yeah. In a way, it's like we address the segment for what the segment is, and then we just get some fan feedbacks. We read out some fan letters. We need one of those, arty walls at some point, with the old music as it goes around, and you see pictures drawn by our listeners. I'm sure they'll be well up for that. Wouldn't you imagine, Phil?
Art Attack 40k edition.
Art Attack. What was the other? Heart Art? Wasn't that the one? Heart Art?
Yeah, I think so.
And wasn't there Smart Art for a while as well?
A bit of everything. So the first one on Facebook, because we get people from Facebook and the old Instagram. First one is Jew Bravo. He says, I'm very excited about the new Maelstrom rules. I think they could be cool for some funny, fast, and then in brackets, in 40k terms, uncomplicated games. I'm teaching some newbies to play 40k, and they have so much to learn and remember about the basic rules and their armies that I like to see some uncomplicated but not boring missions. I hope they fix the objective positions. Wrong placing could win and lose matches against inexperienced players. I also hope they've orientated on the latest Maelstrom missions, where you could build your deck a little bit, so you don't have impossible missions like having to kill psychers without, or do psychic stuff without a psyker and stuff like that. So they are fun, fast, and sort of uncomplicated. They haven't really fixed the objective placements, I think, because you now place the objectives, and actually this is something we didn't talk about, but I actually quite like placing the objectives. I actually find measuring them out before a game based on the deployment map actually quite tedious and time consuming, because you want to be as accurate as possible because you don't want to get it wrong for your opponent. But the measurements sometimes are quite complicated, like how you've got to measure along this axis, then measure down to move it here. And it just seems like a bit of a faff. Whereas you might spend a bit of time umming and ahhing about where to place an objective, but that is ultimately more fun and quicker to do.
And as we established during the segment itself, you're able to place those objectives on terrain features, which is a pleasant change as well. I mean, I think objective placement isn't necessarily as bad as it used to be, because you're not able to place anything within a deployment zone, and not being able to place things within a deployment zone immediately changes the dynamic in terms of whether or not this is something that is, potentially one-sided. So I'm kind of cool with that. I think ultimately for me, it ticks the right boxes in terms of placing the objectives. I think where the complexities of this comes into is some of the wording that they've used and how they've kind of put that forward. But if you establish from the outset that essentially you and your opponent have the area of no man's land to place objectives wherever you want, as long as they're not within 3 of the board edge or 12 of each other, it's a pretty usable system.
I think not placing them in the deployment zone also makes for an interesting game, because you can't be super defensive, because quite often you'd get a game where you go, well, I'll put mine in my deployment zone, you put yours in your deployment zone, and then that's it. And you're sort of fighting out in the middle, not really over anything.
It's also worth stipulating that you can also make it so as you don't really even need to worry about the objectives, especially, right? Like, I mean, maybe in certain instances you'll find yourself maybe needing to do something about the objectives, but you can pick categories that don't have any objective-based objectives. So, you might just be looking to kill characters or cast psychic powers, or get into these table quarters, or get into the middle of the board. So there are ways that you can work around it as a player. And in terms of simplicity, I think a lot of people would argue that Maelstrom isn't simple. But to those people, I would say that the game of GT 2020 has changed to the point that I think it's almost too overly complicated. So I feel like Maelstrom, in a way, because of the fact that you're essentially letting, fate take the wheel, you effectively just have to play it as it lays. And I think that does create a layer of, of interesting gameplay, because ultimately, if me and Phil are playing, he has to do the thing that it says he has to do. And that takes a lot of the kind of, that kind of player agency out of some of those moments, and makes it less about tactical decision. Well, not necessarily tactical decision, but makes it less about gamifying the objectives and more about responding to them.
And there's definitely something where I guess in the GT stuff, you're thinking several turns ahead. Like, this is how I've got to be on this objective or on another objective. How am I going to get there over the course of the next few turns? Whereas this one with Maelstrom is very much more immediate. What am I doing this turn? You can't really plan ahead to other turns. You can kind of make guesses and assertions about what you need to do. Like, I need to be within range of objectives or within range of units to maybe do stuff. But ultimately, I like the fact that there's like, here's your immediate present thing that you have to do. How do you go about doing it? And I think there's less bookkeeping and sort of mental load in trying to remember stuff, because everything is so much more immediate. And as you say, you scrap it at the end of the battle round and sort of reset things. So I think it's just, that makes it for me a much more enjoyable game.
I agree. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that, just to sort of close out, I don't feel like Maelstrom's the game that you're going to give to your friends as beginners, but it's certainly what I would recommend that you do once they've kind of graduated from that kind of initial tier 1 stage of their 40k gaming journey. I think, the standard simple mission that's inside the rule book, or was like one of the really standard missions where it's just there are 4 objectives and they're each worth 3 at the end of the game, or whatever it was. Like, that to me is probably where you start. You learn the the relationship between miniatures, the table, the distances, and thinking in that kind of three-dimensional space, and how you operate within that, and what restrictions there are to the game, as well as what the game allows you to do. And then once you've kind of graduated from that, I think Maelstrom's a great place to go, because I think what Maelstrom gives you the GT won't is Maelstrom will give you the ability to become a much more flexible general, and for you to become much more well-versed in different styles of play. And within that, you'll then find your comfort zone, and you'll find your own personal kind of expression within the game. And that will enable you then to take those learnings into the GT and competitive realm, should that be where you want to take it. And then you can start to elaborate on those things that you've enjoyed, and find your niche. Because the fact is this, guys, there are a lot of people out there chasing the meta, but there are only a handful of people out there who are able to define it. And the people that define it are the ones that win, not the people that chase it. I've very rarely seen someone turn up to a tournament with the list that won 3 weeks ago at a big event and actually win, because someone has turned up with something that either beats it or does something that no one was expecting. So I would strongly recommend to a lot of people, push the boundaries of what you expect or what you think you need to be doing in the game, because 9 times out of 10, the person at the top of the podium is not the person who was doing the thing that people on the internet said was good 3 weeks prior to turning up. But anyway, that's a broader statement, but should we move on to someone else?
Yep, sure. So over on the old Instagrams, we've got the Frozen for All. Having only started playing in the last 6 months or so, I had never played Maelstrom missions, but having done some research, they seem very cool and thematic. I tend to lean more on the fun and narrative than hard competitive games, so I want to try these out. Are there any of the objectives that you guys like the most?
I mean, historically, there were a lot of really cool ones. Now they've become a bit more generic, so it's difficult to necessarily assert there's one I like more than the other. I just like anything that... it's not one thing I like, it's the versatility. It's the toolbox. It's the fact that it's a series of options that facilitate a broad spectrum of options, and that's more interesting to me than sticking with one particular thing. But always, for me, I've always liked stuff that rewards movement or rewards, I suppose, even just a bit of risk. Like, I like the ones that lay down the gauntlet and say, Phil controls that objective, take it off him. All right. Like, those kind of things where you've got to, steal something from someone. I find those things really cool. How about you, Phil?
Well, I was going to say there were some historic ones that I really didn't like. The ones where you've got to hold it for several turns, because again, it's lots of bookkeeping, but also quite hard to do. Whereas the one I really liked, which was the one I did, which is where you've got to reduce a vehicle down a bracket, because that's such a granular thing that has never really been done before. It's like the first time you've seen a rule like this, but it rewards you for it. And it's like, you don't even have to kill it, because sometimes killing vehicles can be hard, but it's very thematic. It's like, cool, I've wounded a monster, I've put a dent in a tank, have some victory points for that and a pat on the back. So that one I thought was very cool and thematic, and sort of something new that we haven't seen before. Yeah.
No, I like it a lot.
Yeah, it was pretty good. So Folkstorm, he said, he starts off as a reply to Archon John. So I'll read out Archon John's one first. He says, I had a love-hate affair with Maelstrom. Its random nature was frustrating when whether you won or lost. I prefer the look of the open war cards, where the randomness comes from the mission creation, and then both generals know what conditions they are under which they're operating.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe you and me, Phil, and some others need to give this open war thing another look, because it has probably fallen down the bottom of our to-dos. But and I agree with Archon John in terms of some of the historical precedents around some of the Maelstrom missions, like in years gone past with Maelstrom, where you just had a deck of whatever it was, like the standard deck of 36 or 40 cards or whatever it was, and you just had to draw it. Like, there was always, I remember there was a Reddit thread about the Tau stratagem deck having the one where you have to cast a psychic power and it has a picture of an ethereal, and all the guys on Reddit are like, what is this? Like, why have you even got this? Like, I'm never going to be able to do it. And the way the game was structured, it was a bit silly, and it definitely did, in the olden times, feel like you could just get completely done over by the card draws. Whereas now it doesn't feel quite like that, because it's a limited series of very specific things. And if you can't do it, you get to choose something that you possibly can do.
I think they've tailored the objectives so every army can, within reason, do most of these things. There are some exceptions where they've then gone, okay, here's the keyword system. So if you can't physically kill a monster or vehicle, you can pick something else or roll again, for example. So I think they've mitigated a lot of the randomness. They've mitigated the points creep, where someone could have a runaway lead because they rolled lots of threes when they were doing their D3 victory points. So I think they've gotten rid of a lot of that kind of jankiness. It is still random though, but I think in a good way, where it's fun and interesting, and you're not going to have the frustration where you've got 3 objectives that you just can't do anything with in that turn. I mean, quite often they might be hard to do, but they're not impossible.
Yeah, which is a big step up, right? I mean, it's much better as a result, for sure.
Yeah. So following on from that, Folkstorm says, is a weird size, like Archon John says. It's a love-hate relationship. I'm notoriously unlucky when it comes to rolling. Rolling poorly. Oh, you said unlucky when it comes to games, actually. Rolling poorly or always drawing some horrible cards. But in the final stages of 8th, I was getting more into it. Maelstrom is about flexibility, both in your army list and mentality, which I think is quite true. Maelstrom isn't as thematic as the new missions, where you can tailor your objectives to your army. But on the other hand, what's good is thematic objectives. What's good in having thematic objectives if you're getting steamrolled by Space Marines anyway? Cry emoji. That's where Maelstrom was interesting. You sort of never knew where you were going. But in 9th so far, the sign of what is to come, well, then I'm excited about what it will be like.
Yeah, I mean, everything Toka said there is totally spot on. I think, theoretically, there is more thematic aspects to the GT mission packs, but I think, I don't know. I think the Maelstrom is the perfect title for Maelstrom, in so much as it showcases the Maelstrom of war. It showcases the ever-shifting, ever-changing circumstances. Now, obviously, it does have a tendency maybe to feel like an ever-changing series of fetch quests in like an MMO, where, it's like, right, go pick up that book. Now bring that book over here. Now put it down again. Now pick it up. And it's like, all these things. But at the same time, I just think the way it plays out in game just rewards a number of more creative decisions, which is good. But, look, pros and cons. I feel like I've probably been a little bit aggressively negative towards some of the GT aspects. So I don't like that. And hopefully that does come across to an extent. It's just that horses for courses. This is just, this feels like I'll have more fun playing it.
Yeah,
essentially where I'm at.
I think there's one aspect from the GT stuff that I do like that isn't in this, and that's the ability to do actions. So, raising the banners, stuff like that, deploying scramblers. While it does get a bit samey, there's none of in this that you can actually do. So maybe if there was a category where you could do that, that would be quite interesting.
That's really interesting, actually, now that you say that. There is no action-themed tactical objectives.
Yeah, I guess it's because they then have to write all those actions down, and that'd be quite an extra page or two or built into the table. But I like the idea that you could raise the banners, put 2 banners up on objectives or something. Now you could say you can just do that technically by just controlling those objectives. And the thing with actions is quite often they take a turn to do, which breaks the whole point of them. But I like the idea, I like the trade-off of I have to do an action, therefore I can't shoot with this unit to control an area. So it could be you've got to go to the center of the board and then deploy some scramblers. So that means I'm doing a unit that can't then just shoot or charge into someone else. So I like that trade-off that could be nice to be added back into this.
Yeah, and again, also, I think, you could start to come up with some creative ideas around how you actually interpret actions into gameplay functions. So essentially, you could find yourself in a situation where you could create an action that has an in-game effect beyond just, raising a banner or deploying a scrambler. Maybe it's something like, there's some maybe universal terminology around, calling in an airstrike or calling in something, like doing something that does something as an action, but then the airstrike needs to then have caused 3 mortal wounds in order to do it. And the unit that performed that action is then, unable to shoot in the corresponding turn or something, to then create a mechanic where you're doing something powerful, but it has an effect on the way the unit behaves in the preceding turn. I mean, again, there's so much more depth that they could create there if they wanted. Again, you're introducing a lot of ideas when you start saying that. Well, when I start saying that sort of stuff, so I feel like again, you got. I think when it comes to the actions, we're still in the crawling stages of their development at the moment. Who knows where they'll go in the future, but at the moment, something like that might be a bit too much, a bit too soon. But where better to try it than in some beta rules for Maelstrom, though, eh?
Exactly. Yeah. One of the other ones we've got is from Cantor Blue. He says, loved the final iteration of Maelstrom where you could build a deck. It got rid of some of the randomness. I played at a tournament with my Crimson Fist in 8th and pulled the crazy card, which gives you 6 victories or something crazy. The other guy wasn't pleased about it, but I was losing at the time, and the randomness of a draw kept me in it. Do you think it's a viable system for tournament play, RTT, etc.? Only obviously as tournament hardcore would obviously hate it. Lol. I think he's probably right in terms of really hardcore tournament players hate it because of the randomness of it. I think, I went to No Retreat before, and they had an element of Maelstrom alongside Eternal War missions. It was a bit like a combined sandwich, and it worked and was quite good fun, actually. So I could definitely see smaller tournaments picking it up as a fun weekender.
Yeah, I think that Maelstrom has worked in tournaments with a number of stipulations, but the thing people don't like about it, and the thing that creates a problem, is people are playing different games, and as a result, the scoring becomes really difficult, because essentially the reason why people like the GT system or the old ITC system is if I am hosting a tournament with 50 tables, every table is playing the same mission with the same maximum amount of points, right? So, Phil couldn't come back to me and say, hey, I just scored 6,000 victory points in that last game, and then someone else who also won scored 6, right? Like, the imbalance that the old Maelstrom system used to created this gulf of difference between players who were all winning, but were winning by huge degrees of difference. Whereas in GT and the old ITC missions, if I win, the maximum I could score is 100. And then because everyone was playing the same mission with the same broad stipulations, even though you can customize it with the secondaries, we can all achieve the same thing. Therefore, it's easy to grade, because if I score 89 and Phil scores 92, Phil has done objectively better than me under the same stipulations, even though his secondaries might have been different, his opponent was different. But it gives off the perceived value of being the same, even if it isn't. But that's why people like these kind of systems, because they create a structure that then feeds into best coast pairings that then enables a lot of the administrative duties of running a tournament to become much more streamlined. So that's why Maelstrom wouldn't work.
I disagree. I think it would work, because they have ironed that out. Like, you can on average, score 15 points a turn unless you get a couple of eights. Right? So you rolled that number 1, and you can score only a maximum of 90 points plus your 10 for being painted. So they've kind of frameworked it around like a tournament in terms of the point scoring. I think you could end up in a situation where people go, oh, well, I had 3 bad objectives and I couldn't do my thing that turn, and the other person did get lucky on their rolls. But I don't feel like when we played yesterday, there was ever a case where I felt like, oh, you just got lucky on your 3 objectives and I did bad on mine, because you can pay for the stratagems that mitigate that quite drastically, to the point where you've got a 50-50 or better 50-50 percentage of what you wanted to get, or going for that, number 1 for the 8 points. So if you're falling behind and you want to try and catch up quicker, you can spend the CP and go, great, I'm going to try and get these big pointers to catch up. So I think there's that whole randomness of the point scoring, I think, has been taken out quite a lot, and I think it would be quite good for a weekender.
Look, I think it'd be great, but I just think that, again, as stipulated, I don't think the hardcore tournament scene will like it, but I think, there's not much they tend to like, I suppose, other than very rigid, specific versions of the game. So, who cares what they would like or don't like? Let's just embrace it anyway.
For sure. We got 2 more, and then we'll call it a day. We got Ethical Ice Cream. He's come back. He said, hi, a bit off topic, but I had a game yesterday and struggled to remember some of the details of my army mid-game. Do you use any tricks to remember things during games? I find things like +1 to weapon strength often gets missed. Looking forward to the next show. Cheers.
Well, hopefully the next show has lived up to your expectations. In terms of tricks and things, look, I mean, I'm the exact same. I forget stuff all the time. Like, there are army lists that I'm more comfortable with, and there are army lists that I'm just lost with. I mean, the trick is ultimately just to play lots, isn't it? I mean, that's how you get good at remembering things. But again, what's really weird now is, more than ever, is there's more depth to what you need to remember, and it becomes very, very, very layered. So I tend to just prioritize very, very army critical rules early doors. So with my relationship with the Death Watch at the moment, I've taken it upon myself to memorize, 10 stratagems that I'm always calling upon. So, your transhuman physiology. There's one, I forget the name of it, but it's 1 CP. And because I've got an Inceptor in one of my kill teams, I'm able to leave or fall back and still shoot. There's one where in the not the upkeep stage, the command phase, where I'm able to gift one of my squads with the chapter tactic of one of the other Space Marine chapters. These are all these things that I remember because they're things that I call upon on a regular basis and use. And then I try really hard to kind of learn the core kind of stat lines of each of my different units. One of the things I've seen Tim, friend of the show, a regular use, he uses a lot of printouts. Like, it's quite incredible when you start playing games against Tim when he's trying to learn his list. Like, his Tyrannid list, he had just like piles of these like cue cards that he just kind of turned up to the tabletop with, and he never ever really ever seems like he's truly confident, but he at least compensates with those. Yeah, with those
I think Games Workshop used to do those like data sheets, and I guess with the cards you still get mini versions of those.
Well, look, I mean, the Warhammer app is a great resource for referencing until you forget what the names of the rules are, and then it becomes really troublesome. Like, it's really easy if you're trying to remember exactly what the exact wording is of an exact thing. But if you're actually trying to think about stuff in a general sense, like, they definitely need to improve some of the search functionality so as I can search via keywords or search.
I think because obviously back in the day, quite often I would print out, do Battle Scribe and print out some pages. So you'd have a sheet of your profiles and another sheet of your special rules, just because they'd be super handy for quick reference. And I know loads of other people quite often do it that way. As you say, I think a lot of it is repetition and just playing the games. I also think if you're just playing with the same army, so if you're playing Space Marines, pretty much try and take the same units time and time again and develop strategies with them. So then you're remembering those specific strategies and the stratagems that you need to play for that army. If you sort of dive in and out of multiple factions or dive in and out of a Space Marine army, but you're swapping your units in and out, you're never going to remember all the special rules that each of those units have. And as you say, just remember the core army rules first and foremost. Try and remember a couple of the stratagems that help that army build that you've got. So if you've got one that's like fall back and shoot, try and remember that one. But don't try and just memorize everything in the book, because there's just too much. Just remember the stuff try and remember the stuff that's really crucial for your army. And as Dan said, you always forget stuff. Like, no matter how good you are, you always forget certain rules, certain stratagems or abilities. Like, it's inevitable. So don't worry about that too much.
Yeah, and a lot of the mistakes you'll make are not necessarily forgetting the rules specifically, but forgetting the specifics. So you might remember Auspex scans for Space Marines, right? And you go, I'm going to Auspex scan. And you know that if a unit is deployed within 12 inches of a Space Marine infantry model, that you are then able to shoot at them. But you might then think, oh yeah, well, it's -1 to hit because that's how it was in their 8th edition book. But actually now there is no -1 to hit. They wrote that out. But you might still have things that you remember rattling around in your brain and things like that. Or you might be doing something that, you know, you can't actually use because this only affects a specific Phobos unit or whatever. But these are just honest mistakes, right? And, you know, ultimately, I think the thing I always openly encourage with players is just to be honest about your mistakes when you make them, because ultimately we're all human, and ultimately if your opponent wants to make a bigger deal out of them than is necessary under a more competitive context, then that is ultimately their right to do so if they choose to do so. But in, you know, normal day-to-day gaming, just be honest with each other and just be like, "Ooh, I forgot about that." I'm famously, taken the mickey out of because I thought that Marnius Calgar had flat damage-free power fists because I literally went, they're the fists of Ultramar or whatever, and somehow, some way in my brain they had become flat damage-free.
You little
I don't know where
cheater.
Exactly. And I played maybe 2 games with Marnius Calgar, and he destroyed way more than he should have done on account of his flat damage-free fist.
Exactly.
And the 2 individuals, Joe and Richie, who were, you know, punished by flat damage-free Calgar, have never let me forget. But it's all in good fun, right? I mean, that's the way it goes.
Yeah. So yeah, down to the last one, we've got mykill_paints. He said also a bit off topic, but vaguely following on from what you were saying in the last episode. I probably not the last episode, maybe the one before. I can't remember now. I played a guy who asked if you could proxy a Valkyrie as a Stormfang gunship. I live in Vietnam, and a lot of the locals proxy stuff in my LFGS because Games Workshop is expensive, and I'm normally okay if it's just changing chapters, for example. But on this occasion, I said no. A different factions model was too much. He said also very much enjoying the show. Keep it going. And also Joe who? ?
Indeed. I have no idea. That guy who complains about Marnie's Calgar having flat damage free. It's a line too far in it. I mean, it depends, doesn't it? I mean, ultimately, if it's your local scene and you know that everyone's in the business of using proxies, maybe there's a compromise, maybe there isn't. I mean, personally, for me, that does start to feel like we've gone too far at this point, because ultimately you're talking about completely different footprint. Well, not footprint so much, but you're talking about just completely different chassis, completely different wingspans, completely different everything. So, yeah, no, I'm with you on that one. I feel like
it just breaks the immersion and the sort of fun of the game.
It depends. If you're playing this guy in a tournament, like, yeah, sure, no way. But if you're playing him, you know, like if Phil's turning up and we're testing some stuff out, then fine, whatever. Like, I'm not going to have a hard time with it. I would, bizarrely, I don't know, in pickup games, you might be all right with it as well, as long as you knew beforehand.
Yeah.
But ultimately,
I would say if you're doing proxying, it's fine if it's one of your mates and you're cool with it. If you're doing random games against people you don't know, I think it's sort of a bit offensive, a bit rude. So don't do it.
I don't know if it's offensive. I just think it's just, it's not cool, is it? It's like, it depends what you want out of it, right? I mean, it's like, ultimately, there are, you know, again, using the horses for courses statement again, it's different things, right? Sometimes it's cool when we get to play games with fully painted armies and we get to take loads of great looking photos and we get to have an immersive game and it's cool. But sometimes we're just, you know, feeling it out and working out how stuff works and how we want it to work. You know, I've done plenty of games with yourself, with Joe, with Richie, with Tim, with whoever, where I've literally just rocked up and been like, oh yeah, this Leviathan's going to be a Redemptor and this thing's going to be this and whatever, like, you know, because we're just figuring stuff out, early codexes or whatever. But again, that's, you know, that's the differences, I suppose, between a regular gaming group of friends and a tournament scene or something a little bit more formal, I suppose. But yeah, no, thank you for showing your support to the show, though. I mean, obviously, that's really cool. I mean, it's great to hear that we have a listener out in Vietnam.
Maybe get on the old Vietnamese Apple account and leave us a 5-star review over on there.
I knew you were going to angle for you're always working it. Like, come on now. Show us your love. On the topic of showing love, actually, just to throw it out there. Well, Phil, do you have anything extra you wanted to add to that whole bit? I don't feel bad if I've just sort of cut you off.
That was it. I was good.
Well, the only thing I was going to say as well is, guys, I would strongly encourage you to check out Aubreii. I know I don't normally do like cheap plugs on this thing, but I've just really enjoyed his content lately, and he's new at it, and what he seems to be doing is really good. I mean, as was illustrated by the fact that me and Phil said mental load at least 3 or 4 times during the course of this podcast. And that's in no small part down to Aubreii in his actually quite fantastic video talking about rules bloat and mental load. Very, very good, functional, interesting videos that he clearly is working really hard on. And, we feel like we might as well throw him a plug because what he's doing is really cool. And we think that you guys would possibly enjoy it. So if you get a chance, Aubreii on the YouTubes. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. He doesn't know that we're doing this.
Checks in the post.
No, there's none of that. It's just one of those things where randomly you encounter something that you think, actually, that's really good. And it's rare as well in our community at the moment to stumble across something that's new and interesting, but also relatively undiscovered as well. Like, it's one of those sort of things. Like, I came across Eon of Battle the other day, and I've not watched any of his content before, and I was drawn to him by some of his clickbaity thumbnails. But, when you get to him and you realize he's already got like 50,000 subscribers, it's like, well, he doesn't need me shouting him out. If anything, I'd like it if he did the same for us, or not the same necessarily, but, did a better job than I just did. But, this Aubreii guy, he's, maybe got 500, 600 subs at the time of recording, and what he does is pretty cool. So can't necessarily do more than just say, hey, take a look. Maybe. Anything else, Phil, that we want to talk about before we go away for the week?
Originally, last week, if you remember, I little teased a story from the Warhammer Core rulebook. I don't know if we've really got time to go into it, so maybe I'll just tease it again for next week.
I think that's what you've perfectly done, Phil. Let's continue to tease it forevermore.
Exactly.
Next week, episode 74, what could Phil be talking about?
Next week, it's a Loyalist Marine turned Chaos that is actually from a Loyalist chapter. If people know, if people know what chapter I'm talking about, let me know in the comments. If not, all will be revealed next week.
All will be revealed in episode 74. We promise we shan't leave you waiting any longer. But for tonight and for now, goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.